Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Finance and Corporate Services Committee. We will get right into it because we have a full day today. Start off, could I get a mover for the consent items moved by Councillor Ioannidis? Any questions on the consent items? Councillor, no questions on the consent items? A comment? Okay. Councillor Ioannidis?
I hear the Union Burger is really good. I had some in Port Elgin, and my wife really loves it. So go and check it out.
Let the record state that Union Burger is fantastic. Okay, Councillor Gazzola.
There are two things. The first one, I wanted to know that they're allowed to stay open till 2. Is that the same as what everyone else does now, or?
In this case, the head office owns Krabby Joe's and Coffee Culture, who have liquor licenses, and they know how to operate using a liquor license, so therefore they're allowed to be open longer than some of those that don't have any experience.
Okay, I didn't have a problem with that because I know that we had one just down the street that we didn't allow, and I think when they're starting up, they need as much help as they can get. The other question I had was to do with item number 3, and I see that, and I might have asked this before, but what does it really mean to have that 30% monthly ratio, and do we ever check it, or, if it's, what happens if that, how do you test that, or what happens? And the point I'm trying to get at, if it's not something we're doing, why are we imposing it?
Ms. Harris?
It's a standard condition that's put into our agreements, and that agreement is sent to the AGCO, and if they choose, they can put it on to the liquor license, and once it's on the liquor license, it's part of the AGCO's liquor license, and they do the enforcement of that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no further questions? Oh, Mayor Zaire.
Thank you. I don't have a question. The question did come up, though, and I just checked with staff. I think this is the first time that our committee meeting is being live streamed. So just so the council is aware of that.
That's correct. Sorry, I meant to mention that. It's not being live streamed, actually. It's not being live streamed to the internet. It's just test run, so it's just being internally recorded.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Again, so no further questions. Those in favor of the consent items? And opposed? That's none. Councillor Fernandez?
Sorry, I meant to do this before we started. Now I see Kelly is not here, Councillor Galloway, Selak is not here. It's been brought to my attention by my health practitioner that I've got, as a result of a tremendous increased sitting from my previous job, that I am now suffering with some sciatica issues. I know that Councillor Singh and Councillor Gazzola all have issues of sitting, and I know in Councillor Selak Galloway's situation, she shouldn't be sitting long. So I'm going to ask kindly of the chair and all the chairs today, and for any meetings in the future, that at the 2-hour point, we spend 5 minutes getting up, walking around. I realize that this could add additional minutes because we all start getting chatty. But a 5-minute stretch, I think, is going to be really good for all of us in our health. We want the same health standards and good working conditions for our staff, and I think we should ask and respect the same for ourselves.
Absolutely. On that as well, I'm making a note here, but should I go too long or skip it or forget, please, any member of council, if you wanted to ring in and say, could we have a quick break, I'd appreciate it. We'll move on to item number 3, the downtown business improvement area, and Mr. Goodeve.
Thank you through your chair, Davey. On May 13th, Council gave direction to staff to issue notice of the passage of a potential passage of a bylaw to expand the boundaries of the downtown Kitchener business improvement area. Accordingly, we issued 267 notices to all the prescribed business property classes within the existing boundaries, which is indicated within the blue on the map that's on the screen, as well as to those to the prescribed business classes that are in the newer proposed area, which is outlined in red. From those notices, we only received 4 objections, one of which was disqualified as it was received from a tenant who does not pay any portion of the property taxes or levy for that property and therefore was ineligible to submit objections. The other objections, 2 of which were received from properties within the existing boundary and the other one was in the new or proposed boundary. Those 3 objections did not come close to meeting the established thresholds required by the Act, so there are no legislated barriers to prevent Council from passing the bylaw, which is attached to the staff report, and staff are recommending approval of said bylaw. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Questions? Councillor Gazzola?
President, I'm the only one that has any questions. When does this bylaw take effect?
Through Chair Davey, this would take effect as of January 1st, 2014. That's to align with when the new levy will be applied.
It would have been, this is a very good map. I've tried to figure that out, yes, on the black and white, and I couldn't figure it out. It would have been nice to have received this in our packs, but maybe in the future. This color is very useful. I'm not surprised at where we're going here, but what impact does this have on these new properties that are now coming under the BIA? Do we have any idea? Like, what does this do to their tax? This is going to be like a tax increase for them. And just, what is the impact? I'm quite surprised that not more have objected, or have they questioned that, or are they pleased with that? Like, the amount of money coming in for the BIA right now is about $700,000, and that's going to go up by another $250,000. That's quite a substantial change.
Mr. Bloom on the fees?
Through the chair, I don't know the exact levy rate, but on about 1,000 square feet, it works out to roughly $600 a year in extra taxes. Just want to make the point, this is most BIAs operate as, and the comment they usually make is it's a self-inflicted tax levy. So they're inflicting it on themselves for the purposes of raising money to support the BIA, which in turn supports their business ventures. So we only had the one objection. We had one person ask about the rate, and when they heard about what the rate was, they were satisfied that it wasn't a major encumbrance.
From what I understand, there are about 60 new properties that come under this? Do we know the assessment of what those properties were? Is that included here or not?
Sorry, the assessment of the properties?
Okay, I won't hold. Everybody seems to be happy with this. I'm quite surprised there wasn't a greater number of people speaking up, but that's fine.
Thank you. Councillor Yurneski.
Yeah, just a couple of questions. I noticed on the map that you handed out that the boundary change, you've got the existing BIA boundary and the proposed. And in the existing, are there going to be some properties that are going to be eliminated from the downtown BIA district as well?
Mr. Bloom, sorry, there you go. 1 second here. There, go ahead.
Through the chair, yes, there are a few, but the ones that are being eliminated are residential properties, so they don't actually contribute any money to the BIA. That's really on the some properties past Cedar Street. So you can see that we've included the two properties on the south end of the intersection of King and Cedar are still in the boundary. They are commercial properties that do contribute, but the ones that do not have been eliminated.
Okay. The other question I have is that you did have 4 objections, of which 3 are the more legitimate, you're saying. Did you get any responses in support of this expansion?
Through the chair, Davey, there's no formal responses received in support. The Act, as part of the notice, just advises sort of how to file an appeal or an objection to it. I know, though, that the BIA, as well as economic development staff, did go out and do quite a bit of public consultation, and so Corey might be better able to speak to the feedback he received as part of that process.
Sure. Through the chair, Shannon Weber from the BIA met with all of the major property owners who would have seen the biggest impact, and all of them, at least in her discussions with them, were supportive of this change.
Okay, and the 3 objections that you got were on what grounds?
Through the chair, I think the 2 within the existing boundary, I don't think fully understood the question being asked. I don't even think they actually realized that they were in an existing BIA boundary. Really the one that was really the sole objector outside of the existing boundary, for him and his company, he just believed the BIA didn't add value to his business, and then hence didn't want to pay the additional tax levy.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Rabinovich.
Thank you very much. Just further to the question that Councillor Yunetsky asked with respect to the properties on Cedar that are being removed. I recognize they're residential properties right now, but and as residential properties, they don't get charged the surcharge. Is that correct? So does it make sense to be removing them? I mean, I think particularly of the properties at Cedar and Charles, you know, I don't know what their specific zoning is, but with the LRT hub going to be, not the hub, but rather one of the stations going to be in that area, I can see the potential for redevelopment. So does it not make sense to leave them in the BIA boundary, and then we don't need to revisit the boundary issue if they're redeveloped at that time?
Through the chair, certainly not an incorrect statement. Just to give you an idea of the BIA's longer-term intent, ultimately they want to see their boundaries align with the city's downtown boundaries, which for the most part, you know, beyond this phase would mean extending out to include the remainder of the Innovation District out to Breithaupt and the rail lines. So they see this as a first phase, and in subsequent years when they feel timing is right, they would expand further. So I think that's another opportunity where if there is redevelopment south of Cedar Street, then perhaps that's the time and place to move the boundary even further south if it makes sense.
Okay, so you don't expect any sort of redevelopment on those properties in the near future?
Through the chair, I would say not in the next 3 to 5 years. I think it's a longer term.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Councillor Singh.
Yes, thank you. Just seeking for a better clarification on the map. So it's quite clear as to the defined boundary change for the proposed BIA properties. But for the downtown urban growth boundary, so which is the city's downtown boundary, is there a change that's being made on that one as well, or that's existing as is?
Through the chair, no, that boundary is set and isn't changing. Essentially, if you're looking at the map, the BIA boundaries would shift from the blue line currently to the red line proposed.
So, and that's where my question laid. So you see along King Street, obviously, beyond the railway tracks, so the perimeter building, so the Breithaupt development that's happening there, that's outside of the downtown boundary. What would be I guess, the reasoning of leaving that out, especially that being a strong, I guess, a business generator in the near future.
Through the chair, so to speak on behalf of the BIA, who ultimately this was their proposed boundary. I think it was in part that the building isn't fully leased, isn't fully occupied, and in part their capacity to bring on new businesses. They did debate whether they just expand to the fullness of the boundary today, and I believe their response was that they just didn't have the staffing capacity to handle that much additional levy and new membership. So I think their logical mind said, let's wait until the Innovation District is far more built out, including the Bright Up block, and come back in 2 to 3 years' time and propose to expand later. So again, that was just the rationale that they used.
Okay, so that's what I assumed, that we would probably be revisiting this again, and that kind of speaks to some of the Councillor Brovenovich's concerns, especially development along the LRT route. You'll probably see development beyond the boundaries that are set right now. Okay, thank you.
And quick question, Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, does that mean that all the areas that are in gray are exempt at this point? And is that what that means?
Through the chair, pardon, I didn't fully hear the question.
That all the areas on this map that are in gray, inside those blue and red lines, they're exempt?
Through the chair, in white. So the gray, or at least in the map, the color map, the gray is the building. If the property, I believe, is colored white, that's an exempt property because it's either a public entity or a place of worship.
Well, we're looking at the big mall on King and Frederick and Duke. Is that exempt, or is that?
Through the chair, no, that one would be included. That one, they pay the levy, as does the Manulife building. Basically everything, I know it's hard to see on some of the properties where the gray buildings extend to the edges, but anywhere you can see reddish pink, that's a commercial property that would be affected by the tax levy.
So the whole property is?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no further questions. I would be open to comments now. Any comments on this? Councillor Glenn Graham.
Just briefly, because I represent the downtown and Councillor Etherington isn't here. The BIA's had a lot of interest, bless you, in supporting the expansion from businesses within and beyond the current boundaries. So I think this is something where Councillor Yaneski asked about the positive responses. We don't have any written, but we do have a lot of anecdotal responses and a lot of positive feedback about the work the BIA has done. This is really a vote of confidence in the current work that they're doing and the vision that they've expressed.
Apologies, I needed a mover. Could you be moved by Councillor Glenn Graham? Councillor Naidus?
I'm just going to declare a pecuniary interest in that property downtown.
Property in the downtown, okay. Noted. Okay, a recorded vote has been called. The voting is open. And that carries. Very good. We will be moving on to item number 4, but I just need to give clerk a moment to reset. While we're waiting, Councillor Naidus?
I have a pecuniary interest as well on this item as
item
well,
number 4.
as the high property downtown.
Okay. Sorry, Councillor Singh?
Yes, I think I do have a conflict as well, as my parents own property in the defined green. If you look at the previous map that we just had, in the green part, which is the downtown urban growth boundary. So any incentives would be for that defined area, or would it be within the BIA boundary? So any incentive benefit would apply to.
Through the chair, if in your staff report you switch to page 4-32, you'll see the exact boundary, which is relatively close to the urban growth center boundary. If the property in question is within that gray boundary, then it would be potentially able to benefit from the incentives.
Okay, in that case, I'll declare a pecuniary interest as well.
Okay, so for the clerk, Councillors Ioannidis and Singh have declared a pecuniary interest. And just let me know when you're ready, Mr. Green. Okay, we're good to go. Mr. Bloom, when you're ready.
Good morning, members of committee. Before I get into sort of the meat of the incentive review, I just wanted to give you an idea of the process. So we're in phase 1 right now. It's essentially a 2-phase process. Phase 1 really is for you as council to ultimately provide staff with a series of recommendations that give us direction on what changes you want made to any of the incentive programs that we've got. Phase 2 would be the actual changes to the programs. Actually all of these programs require some form of statutory process before you can change them. So really this first phase is just for you to give staff direction on what changes you want us to bring forward. In terms of phase 1, staff completed its comprehensive review and we tabled the discussion paper in May. We've been meeting with stakeholders in the community since then. Today's purpose is really to have a full discussion with you. In the staff report, we've included preliminary recommendations. What we'll do after today is we'll take your feedback and we'll come back to you probably in September with formal recommendations for you to consider, at which time that would be the end of phase 1. So we're really not looking for any formal recommendations today. That will happen in September. This is really just a chance for a good discussion. So, why do an incentive review now? There's a few reasons. First is most of the programs actually originated almost 20 years ago. And obviously the context of downtown is very different today than it was 20 years ago. For those that perhaps don't remember downtown in 1995, I was not downtown in 1995, I was in high school, so just from what I can glean from various reports, it wasn't in a good state. It's been phrased that the business community essentially had turned its back on the downtown in the 90s for a series of reasons. And with increased suburban expansion and the arrival of big box, the situation looked like it wasn't going to get any better, but in fact downtown was going to get worse. So the then Mayor Christie at the time formed what was called the Mayor's Task Force, where they brought together business leaders and community leaders and to determine a process for improving the downtown. And the conclusion they came to was that downtown essentially needed to be open for business, which means take away any possible encumbrances, whether that be zoning or development process, as well as offer any incentives that we possibly could, basically to attract business to the core. And it was essentially, we're, if I could paraphrase, happy to take whatever we can get. I would say that the context today is much different than that. There's significant energy and excitement about the downtown and significant opportunity. So it's a perfect time to review. One of the contextual changes from 1995 to today is that I believe the community has a much higher expectation of what they want to see downtown than perhaps they did in the mid-90s. To give you an example, one of the buildings that benefited from the current incentive program is the relatively new apartment building at Queen and Weber. I believe it received roughly $1.5 million worth of incentives, and the community response was, great that we've got 200 new residential units downtown, but they really disliked the look of the building. And the reaction was, if the city is offering incentives, we expect a higher quality end product than what that building did. So that's just one example of what we think the community's priorities have shifted slightly. A few other reasons why this is a timely review is the current development charge bylaw will expire, and we have to enact a new one next year. Our facade grant program will end at the end of this year, and we have to make decisions on whether we continue that program or not. And what may seem slightly unrelated, but it will make sense a little later on, is our parks staff are becoming more and more concerned about the amount of pressure being put on Victoria Park today, and moving forward with more intensification that we may need to look at other options to alleviate some of that pressure, which is essentially just volume of people using it and the wear and tear that causes. So all of those we think are reasons why we should undertake the review, which is what we've done. So to give you some context, there are essentially 3 buckets of incentives. There are those that are targeted downtown at major redevelopments. You can see the 4 in the top group. There are a series of what I would call targeted incentives, which are not necessarily meant for the major redevelopment projects, but more targeted at for the use of businesses or store owners. And you can see those. And then there's a group of citywide incentives which aren't part of this review. We just wanted to look at the top 2 that are exclusive to the downtown. Brownfield remediation, adaptive use, and heritage tax rebates aren't part of this review. So in the discussion paper, there's 4 main sections, and I'm going to walk you through each of those. The first is just to talk about today's economic context. We evaluated all of our current programs to see how they match up with today's context. We look at our ability to fund these incentives, and then some options and recommendations for moving forward. So what's today's economic context look like? We developed a series of pro formas for 3 different types of redevelopments. Essentially, the rule of thumb is that if this formula doesn't work for any development that's privately funded, which means that the amount of money they expect to make on a project, if that isn't 15% higher than the cost of construction, nothing gets built. So if this formula doesn't work downtown, nothing gets built downtown. And essentially we don't see tax assessment growth because we don't see new development. So what is included in the development cost? You can see the list there. The one aspect that we as a municipality have an ability to control is the development fees, which in some cases can actually equal up to 15% of the cost of development. So we do in fact have an ability to affect a project being profitable or not, and hence being built or not. So we built some pro formas to try to test whether we could meet this threshold. This gives you an idea of, for that top bucket of incentives for the major redevelopments, the kind of value they provide. The program is down the left-hand side, so the 3-year tax exemption all the way down to the development charge exemption. And you can see for the different types of redevelopment how much that equates to. So the easiest one usually to understand is residential condos. You add up the value of the 4 incentives, and it works out to about $16,000 per unit. And you can sort of see the rest. These are all contained in the report if I move too fast for you. So what we did is we built these pro formas, and we tried to put them on one graph that we hope is easy to understand. So this is the first one. So for I believe I should say 300 unit residential condo, On the bottom is the cost of construction, which can range typically anywhere from $146 a square foot up to $200 a square foot. On the left-hand column, you see the sale price that per square foot that you would have to sell a building at in order to hit your 15% profit without any incentives. So that blue line tells you what kind of sale price they would need to get if we weren't involved. So for example, at $200 a square foot, if that's the cost of construction, that can only be profitable if they're able to get sales prices in the range of $365 a foot. What we've shown you with the two dashed lines, the purple is the average sale price of residential condo units downtown over the past 5 years. So this is Kaufman, Le Marché, Arrow, etc. On average, they're selling at roughly $316. The one high one, that's One Victoria, which is probably the highest sale prices we've seen to date, and that was roughly $362 a foot. So what we conclude from this is that we could see development, and it would happen if buildings were built between $146 and $162 a foot, because the needed sale price is below the average. The challenge, of course, is that the types of buildings that I think staff want to see, and we think the community wants to see, whether that's high-quality architecture, good quality materials, LEED certification, those types of buildings typically cost from $175 to $200 a square foot. So city center condos, One Victoria, those all cost somewhere in the range of $175 to $200. Typically closer to the 200. So if we want to see high quality design with many of these great features, it's not feasible in with today's prices. This is the same analysis, but for a rental situation. Again, it's the same numbers on the bottom and the same numbers on the side. So in order to be profitable, if you're building a building at $200 a square foot, you need to lease it at $1.86. This one looks far better because most of the blue dots are below the average. But I will say that the high mark of $2.29 a foot, that is what Kaufman lofts are renting at, and that is the highest rental rate we've seen in the region. It's far and above any other project. Most of the apartments you'd be familiar with, they're typically renting at around $1.30. So the ones that have gone up around Victoria Park, if you're familiar with Eugene Drulo's projects, his are typically renting around $1.30 a foot, which is below what the profitability mark would be. A developer like that, there are other reasons why he's able to build and make profit while most others can't. This is a major office redevelopment, which you can see the blue line is far above both the average and the peak rate. In fact, in order to build the highest quality building we could at $242 a foot, you'd have to lease it at $30, almost $31 a foot, plus your CAM fees. These are Boston, San Diego, Silicon Valley rates. So I like to say this is why we haven't seen a new office building built in any of the urban areas in our region in probably over a decade, unless it was purposely built for a predetermined tenant or done for government purposes. It's simply the numbers don't work. The main encumbrance here is structured parking. That's about a third of the development cost, so that's why you'll see office being built in the suburbs with surrounded by parking, but it becomes economically impossible in an urban setting. If you look at the same scenario but done with the intent of ultimately selling it to a REIT, much like the Tannery, for example, Caden built it, but they ultimately sold it to a REIT. The numbers are a little better, it's a little closer, and the reason is that REITs typically don't pay financing fees because they typically have cash in hand, and financing is a significant chunk of the costs. So we get close in that scenario, but again, to build on spec in hopes of filling the building and selling it to a REIT is a risky business that few are willing to do. So based on those scenarios, our conclusions are that the market isn't quite ready for us to completely be out of the incentive game, that incentives are still critically important if we want to see privately funded development happen downtown. That was the big bucket. In terms of the target incentives, there's really no way of coming up with the same economic model to determine whether they're important or necessary or not. So we just simply have to go on interest. So to give you an idea, the facade loan program, which we discontinued in 2009, over a 5-year period, it facilitated 6 facade improvements, which were probably the only facades that got fixed in that 5-year period. We turned that program into a grant program in 2009, and we've already seen 45 projects completed. We have another, I think, 15 that are on the books, and ultimately, over about a 5-year, 6-year period, we'll see probably close to 70 to 75 storefronts be improved, which, based on the previous 5 years, tells you that there's significant interest and importance in that program. Those 75 businesses represent about half of probably the total building stock. Building permit rebates, you can see it's fairly active. We've had 21 rebates since 2006. What's interesting of note is the vast majority, I think 18 of those 21, were for smaller projects. So whether that's a retailer redoing their interior of their building, that tend to be the typical user of that program. In our discussions with the major developers, this program, the building permit rebate is, I don't want to call it a drop in the bucket, but it's less important to them in terms of its financial value. But it is critically important for the small businesses who, to get their building permit rebate can be the difference between them fixing up their store and not. In terms of Upper Story Loan Program, it was a program that we ran for 5 years. We had 6 projects, 6 really great projects, but we just found there wasn't significant interest in that program, so we haven't extended it beyond 2010. So our conclusions on the targeted incentives, you'll see later, is that the facade grant program seems to be critically important to facilitate redevelopment, and there's an importance in the building permits for smaller users. So the next section that I'll get into is the evaluation of our current incentives. So within those 2 buckets, there's essentially 6 programs. You can see them listed down the left-hand side. We evaluated them based on 6 criteria, and you can see those across the top. So is it financially relevant to the end user? Does it make a difference between them going ahead and not going ahead? Is it user-friendly for them, or is it a very difficult program for them to navigate? The middle 2 speak to the importance of quality. So would staff and council have discretion about who gets an incentive and not? And the 4th one is, can we impose objectives like LEED certification or design standards? The 5th one is it financially predictable for our budget, or is it open-ended and unpredictable? And we don't know how much every year it could cost us. And then the last one, is it easy for staff to administer? So we carefully reviewed all 6, and this is, you can see it on page 15 if you want to see it in full. But this was our conclusions that really only the facade grant program was meeting all 6 of those objectives. All other 5, in some way, shape, or form, could use some changes to meet all 6 of those objectives. And you can see the 3-year tax exemption, for example, didn't hit any of those objectives. So then, what then is our, if we see a need for incentives, what's our capacity to fund these incentives? If you took all of the money that we have set aside already in existing budgets, and you were to pool that in one pot, you've got about $3.5 million left. Which, if we're talking about major redevelopments, that's 2, maybe 3 redevelopment projects before that money would be fully exhausted. And as you know, if you wanted to increase that amount by $1 million a year, for example, then it's for every million, it's a 1% tax increase. 2 side notes there. I mentioned the concern of our park staff about the need for new parkland to take some of the load off of Victoria Park. One of the ways of financing that, as you know, is through cash in lieu of parkland dedication, which right now we're not collecting in the downtown, which could be a source of revenue to help finance that acquisition. And we'll talk a little bit later on about a need that staff have identified for a new program, which we're calling a landing pad program, but we'll give you more detail about that in a second. So we've sort of shown you the economic context. We've shown you how our programs stack up, and we've shown you our ability to fund. Based on those three sets of analysis, we've come up with these 5 options for moving forward. And you'll see in the report pros and cons for each. So number 1 is status quo, stay as is. The biggest reason or the biggest concern with the status quo option is a number of those programs. The development charge exemption, for example, it's an open-ended program with no upset limit for funding. So if you had 5 major projects come in within a year, the City of Waterloo experienced this, we would be searching for many millions of dollars to help backfund those payments. Option number 2 is the one that we're suggesting, which I'll go into a little more detail, but basically let's stay with the existing programs, but let's modify them to meet today's needs. We looked at the option of taking that remaining funding, the $3.5 million, and any money that we would add to that, and just do one consolidated grant. So have one program, not 4, and give out 1 or 2 grants a year to the biggest and best projects that came forward. The challenge with that is that this council would be continually required or needing to find money to keep funding that pot once the existing 3.5 is gone. And it may, in a year where you may have 4 projects that need it, you'd only be able to finance 1 or 2. We looked at option number 4, which is, let's not do incentives. Let's try to affect the other side of the equation, which is the purchase price, by doing strategic initiatives that would be cause for people to pay more to live downtown. The challenge with those types of initiatives is they take time to come to fruition, and we would probably see all of the projects that are already in the queue grind to a halt and not go forward because the incentives wouldn't be available for them. And then option 5 is discontinue all the programs and just let the market run its course, which based on our economic analysis would suggest that we wouldn't see very much development moving forward unless it was largely publicly funded. So based on that, we've concluded that option 2 is the best approach, and this is what we're suggesting we would do. So if you look at the major redevelopment buckets, what we're suggesting is we eliminate the 3-year tax exemption and the building permit rebate from this bucket. These programs do come as a cost to the taxpayer, although we can set a limit of funding. It is a cost to the taxpayer. They are the smallest and generally speaking the less significant of the incentives. What we're suggesting with the parkland dedication fee, which currently now nobody pays parkland dedication downtown, we're actually, instead of an exemption, suggesting a reduction, which seems like we're going in the opposite direction. We're actually adding more of a cost onto the developer. But what we're saying is let's put a modest cost on there. We've suggested, if 100% is what we're allowed to ask for, let's ask for 15% of that. So it still isn't an encumbrance, but it's generating some revenue for us to potentially acquire parkland in the future that's close to the downtown. The most significant change, though, is what we're suggesting is going from a development charge waiver to an exemption. So I'll sort of pause here and give you sort of a fuller explanation of what this means. This is probably the more critical element of this proposal. Presently, there are 3 essentially rings of the downtown or the development charge bylaw. There's a suburban rate. There's an urban rate, essentially for everything within the bounds of the expressway. They pay a slightly reduced rate from the suburban rate. And then there's the downtown, which the developers essentially get their fee waived. But what that means is that the city is actually back paying those dollars. So by a city center, for example, when it builds, it's not just a foregone revenue that we're just saying, no, we're not going to collect it. We waive it, and in fact, we have to find the money to pay those incentives, and that goes into the development charge fund, which gets used for suburban expansion. So it is a cost to the taxpayer to offer it as in the current situation. What we're suggesting we do is we go back to the approach we took pre-2009, which is essentially to, instead of offering a waiver, you cut a hole in the bylaw so that the bylaw doesn't actually apply to the downtown. What that means for the developer is the same thing. They don't pay the development charge fee, but I mean, what it means for us is that we don't actually have to backfund that waiver into the development charge fund. So you don't have to worry about 3 projects coming in and finding the money to backfund those charges. Sounds too good to be true. There must be a catch. The catch is that while this bylaw would be in place, you can't go to the development charge fund to pay for growth-related capital projects within the downtown boundary. Those would have to be financed through the capital budget. So that is the inherent risk with that approach. Although looking forward, we don't see any major growth-related infrastructure costs coming in the next 5 years. So we think that the shifts to these 4 programs and the suggested changes, the impact to the developer, for example, for residential condo, is only about $2,500. But the upside for us as a city is that most of that cost is no longer a cost that's built into our tax base. It's either foregone revenue or just fees that aren't collected. So we think that mitigates a lot of the financial risk with development charges. Should make a point that of the development charge fee waiver, our portion is only about 1/3. The region makes up 2/3 of that fee waiver. And in fact, if you look at the $16,000, for example, for a residential condo unit, which is the total value of the incentive right now, half of that comes from the region through the development charge waiver. It's important to note that they're going through this exact same exercise. Historically, they've made it a point that they will just do whatever the local municipality does. So when City of Waterloo eliminated their exemption, the region followed suit and eliminated theirs. And as we provide ours, they provide theirs. Certainly at a staff level, we've strongly suggested to them that we urge them to continue that approach. But if there's a political position that this council wanted to take, then certainly it's for you to do. Just wanted to highlight the importance of that issue. So included, though, in these changes is we're suggesting that we would add some policies to the official plan, which would enable us to hold developments that would get incentives to a higher standard, whatever those standards would be determined to be. So that's the big bucket for the major redevelopments. This is the suggested changes for those targeted incentives. What we're suggesting is the building permit rebate program continue, but we reduce the scope and shift some of the funding. So presently, it's open to any project with no upset limit other than the availability of funding, which right now we have roughly $80,000 that gets put into this program on an annual basis. What we're suggesting is we will limit that to $10,000 a year and limit the permit rebates to $1,000 per application. So it's essentially just targeted at shopkeepers and store owners or restaurant owners who we've noticed for them it's important for them to get their permit rebate back. That can be the difference between going forward or not. And then what we're suggesting with the remaining $70,000 is that we dedicate that and direct that to the facade grant program so that the facade program would have ongoing funding that's already built into our capital budget. And then the third and final change is that we eliminate the upper story grant program. We don't see any more interest today than we saw when we stopped offering it a few years ago. And we take the remaining funding and shift it to what we're calling a landing pad grant program. So I'm going to give you a break for me, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Regier, who's going to talk about the landing pad grant program.
Mr. Regier. Oh, okay. Can we move over?
It's perhaps a little bit easier up here.
Agreed.
Yes, thank you very much. We've talked about the proposed landing pad program in the past. I'll give you the Coles notes. What we're proposing now to Council is that we allocate the remaining funding in the upper story residential program reserve fund, which is in the amount of about $600,000 to the startup landing pad program. This funding would be available to landlords and tenants that came out of the Communitech incubation program. They were technology startups. They would be potentially startups associated with and supported by the Waterloo Region Small Business Centre. And these funds would be used to offset their leasehold improvements up to a maximum of $40,000 per floor of upper story space in the downtown. And, this would equate to approximately $10 per square foot. And this would be entirely a matching grant program, so this would be, we would contribute an equal amount up to $40,000 to what the tenant invested or the landlord invested in leasehold improvements. And eligible costs would potentially include workplace amenities. We want to make sure that we've got high quality upper story facade, so we want to make sure that there's no broken glass in the windows and that the facade is in good shape, as well as potential amenity costs like, for example, elevators. There are a number of in terms of the rationale for this program, we see some risks that are worth considering. We're seeing an explosion of startup activity coming out of the Communitech Hub right now. A lot of the startups that are being incubated in the tannery are receiving funding from investors in Toronto, in Silicon Valley, and places like Boston and New York. Those companies are under pressure to locate in these larger centers. An investor from Silicon Valley might, for example, argue that the valley is the better place to optimize the chance of success for a startup. We feel that it's important to embed the startups here in our community, in the downtown. Our downtown is a perfect larger scale incubator environment for startups, and it provides a supportive environment with easy access to their mentors and to their support network at the tannery, and they're an ideal fit to the downtown because it's actually easier for us to retrofit upper story space for startup incubation than it is to do it for residential for fire code reasons. There's a larger objective here as well, and that is that our downtown is now acquiring a reputation as one of the top centers for startup entrepreneurship in Canada. It's a place which has received international press recently for the energy of our startup ecosystem. We're starting to see people in California, New York, Boston pay attention to what's going on here, and it provides one of the most exciting growth opportunities for our regional economy. I'd like to just point out that all of the major companies which currently provide the bulk of employment in the Waterloo region were once startups. Of course, we all remember Research in Motion, BlackBerry, and the growth that emerged out of that company in the 1990s and early 2000s. But it's well worth noting that Christie Digital was a startup, Electrohome was a startup, Manulife, Schneider's, Desire to Learn were all startups at one point in time. And so the importance of our startup ecosystem is that it provides the feedstock, provides all of the small companies that ultimately can support our economy and grow employment exponentially in the future. I'd like to also point out that really our competition here, and this is an important point, we've seen some discussion in the media about this program and our position relative to our sister cities, Cambridge and Waterloo. The important point here is that our competition is not Waterloo, it's not Cambridge. We are in competition here with Silicon Valley, with New York City, with Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts, with Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, the great cities of North America and the world. Zurich, Switzerland, London, UK, Paris, Berlin, Germany have high energy startup ecosystems, and that is where our competition is. From an economic development point of view, we thoroughly embrace collaboration with Waterloo and with Cambridge on this project, and would look forward to startup landing pad programs in those cities if they chose to move in that direction. So that's it for me, Corey.
So just the one, Rod sort of described what the program will look like. The one other option that community improvement plan programs like this would have is the ability for us to lease our facilities to third-party operators who may operate them as the space as some form of landing pad type program. So just making the note that most of our buildings are within the existing CIP boundary with the exception of 79 Joseph. So if that was a building that we wanted to consider as a potential landing pad, given its proximity to the hub and the Kitchener Studio project, then that's something that we would consider. Just in terms of process, just to make sure you're clear though, to put this program in place requires us to go through a public process, which is a minimum of 3 months, and there'll be a number of council discussions. So at this point, you're just suggesting to us whether you want us to pursue this or not. We're not actually approving this program. That wouldn't happen for many, many months. So that was our analysis. What did we hear from stakeholders? We heard 3 main points come out. First one was simply, if we're going to discontinue any programs, please offer reasonable sunset dates, so those that have made decisions, development decisions based on the existing programs, that they have the time window to complete their projects before the funding expires. One stakeholder suggested if you're going to look at reviewing the current parkland dedication policy, let's do that citywide, which I think is staff's intent anyway. And then we had one stakeholder, Fusion Homes, suggest that we should consider expanding the boundary east to Betzner to include the three blocks south of the market that are prime for redevelopment and are surround the market and are close to the future rapid transit station. We were also asked to calculate the number of years it would take the city post-occupancy of a residential condo unit. How many years would it take for us to collect the equivalent amount of tax revenue to equal the amount of incentive that we would be giving that unit? So if the unit was, an average unit price was $200,000, it would take the city about 5.37 years before we collected the equivalent tax revenue off of that new unit. If it was a $250,000 priced unit, then it's obviously shorter. And then you can also see the region's numbers for their part of the development charge exemption. So it would take them 5 years to recoup in increased assessment what they would have given in as an incentive. So with that, we're open to your feedback and comments, and as I said today, really we want to hear your views so that we can come back to you in September with any changes to the preliminary recommendations, so that in September you can adopt formal recommendations which would direct us to continue on into the implementation phases. Before I turn it over, I just want to say thanks to a number of staff. This was a project that a number of different departments participated in, so big thanks to all those that were involved. So with that, these are the preliminary recommendations from the staff report, just putting them up there for reference for you. We're open to your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you, Corey and Rod, for the presentation. There are a number of questions. We will start with Councillor Verbenovich.
Thank you. I just want to check though, is there a delegation on this or are they just here taking notes? Okay. First of all, to thank you for clearly a very thorough analysis and report, both of the program and where it's been and where you think it needs to go in the future. I think it's actually pretty reflective of what my gut feeling was in terms of which programs have been working and which ones have been less successful, and some of the things that I think we need to do going forward. I do have a few questions though, and then a couple quick comments. But specifically on the programs that are sort of encouraging more residential development, they really seem to be geared more towards the large-scale condo as opposed to more intensified uses of properties, either through brownstones or low-rise, low to mid-rise apartment building condos, that kind of thing. Should we not be ensuring that whatever programs we have in place are encouraging both of those kinds of things within the area?
Through the chair, I think the answer is yes. Most of these incentives, the value is typically per unit. So whether you're building 10 units or 200 units, it's the same value per unit. Typically speaking, if the building is 3.5 stories or less, meaning it's typically built out of wood frame as opposed to concrete construction, the pricing is far less than what I showed you. So the construction costs are typically around $100 to $135 a foot, as opposed to the numbers I showed you, which can be as much as $200. So we've been having some discussions with the Home Builders Associations to try to understand the economics around a stacked townhome that's 3.5 stories that doesn't need to be built out of concrete. Is there a model for that downtown, and where is that appropriate? So I think it's something that we're evaluating, because there's definitely you're more likely to see that type of development financed without an incentive. Our incentives certainly encourage that than the major developments.
Okay. And so I guess as part of that consultation, that's something that could potentially come back with later versions of this?
Through the chair, we're actually meeting with the home builders on Friday, so we'll ask them those very questions and report back in September.
Okay, great. I know one thing that I've raised in the past and have asked staff to look at, and I don't know if this is one area where it could be looked at, and it's the notion of creating or encouraging a LEED Gold standard for developments, particularly in the downtown from a sustainability point of view. And I know other cities have looked at that. One of the ways they've provided incentives for that is not necessarily through actual dollars, but fast-tracking the application process. I think Vancouver is one that comes as an example of that, because ultimately time is money for a developer, and so the quicker they can get going, the faster they can recoup their investment and put some of those dollars into those LEED kinds of initiatives. Have we looked at anything like that through this? And if not, can we still going forward in the next number of months?
Through the chair, in fact, in the mayor's task force, that was one of the outcomes and results that happened, was that they set up a process whereby projects in the downtown got streamlined and had additional staff support to make sure that issues got dealt with. Certainly something we can look at. I think the impact is a little less here than in say Vancouver and Toronto, where you're behind a queue of a multitude of projects. So in those instances, it is money by having a sped up process. this market, it tends to happen really in accordance with the market pressures as opposed to our process. At least on the major projects. If it's a smaller project, I think that's a different story. But I think that's certainly something that before September we can take a look at and see, what kind of process-related incentives can we offer, and would that make a difference?
Okay. Just two quick comments. Very glad to see this notion of additional parquet land being included in here. While I recognize that that's going to create some challenges in terms of the removal of the parkland dedication waiver by replacing it with a small one, I think it's going to be necessary to have some small parquets as we intensify in various sections. And finally, I think we can't underestimate the importance of the landing pad initiative going forward. I'm not sure if Rod mentioned this. I mean, he talked about the startup growth, but we know that in the last year, we've seen us go from about 1 startup in this region to 2 startups in this region a day on average. And certainly, I think we are competing with the kinds of cities that you've referenced. So we want to continue to see this grow our local technology ecosystem, and now with the Kitchener Studio project, the digital media incubation that can come out of that, I think it's going to be important to see that going forward. We've made some really positive steps over the last number of years, and I think we need to keep building on those. So good work, and I look forward to the public debate in the coming months.
Okay, and if actually the rest of certainly. As the rest of council speaks too, if you'd like to, just in the interest of time, make your comments at the same time as your questions, I think that's appropriate. Councillor Yaneski.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation to both of you, and I'm glad to see that this has come forward. As I know we did have these incentives, but everybody was curious as to how well they're being taken advantage of, implemented, whether they're beneficial to the industry or not. So this is a good synopsis of what you presented. I appreciate that. However, I do have a number of questions here. Maybe you can help me out. On page 6 of your report, or 4-13, you did that you showed the residential condo analysis as to the cost of construction versus the sale price, and you had an average price of what's out in the market in terms of the cost, and it's basically a straight line across the graph, whereby the construction cost based on a dollar goes from a bottom left to an upper right in terms of the more it costs, the more you need to have in terms of trying to get your money back to make a profit, otherwise it doesn't deal. But the average line that you've taken is basically being both the lowest and the highest and made it as an average. But wouldn't that line need to be skewed to be also in a right angle, sort of an angle similar to the line there, to show whether it is feasible or not? I mean, sure, you may have $200 in terms of cost, but anything over $315, is that what you're saying, that there's the profit, or really would it be $365 is the profit?
Yeah, through the chair. So if you look at for example, the $200 per square foot, and you see the blue dot up at the top, basically what this says is that in order to be profitable at $200 a square foot, you need to be able to sell your units for $362 a square foot. So our average is $315. And the highest is $362, which is One Victoria, as I mentioned. So what this suggests to you is that if you can only get the average asking price, you can't make profit. You need to be up near asking what they're asking at One Victoria, and you have to be able to sell at that rate in order to be profitable at about $200 a foot of construction costs.
What they're going to sell at King and Victoria, is that the example you're using?
Yes.
So that's a more high quality building with more bells and whistles to the units. Is that correct, or to the development?
That's correct. And in our discussions with them, they're, even with our incentives, they're right on the line of meeting their profit targets. I didn't mention in my report, but we've also seen that there are certain parts of the downtown that can command that price. Clearly, King and Victoria can because of its proximity to the Future Hub, the
Right.
School of Pharmacy, etc. And potentially lands around Victoria Park and maybe Centre in the Square could command close to those prices. Our other parts of our downtown would struggle, I think, to get beyond the 315 and push up to that 362 mark. So I think there are only certain areas of the downtown that you could, without our involvement, actually build a building at $200 a foot.
Okay, so basically, if you've got the right location and the right product and those benefits, if you can sell it for 365, then it's not an issue.
That's correct.
Whereby when you go down to 276, well, you have a lower quality building in terms of the amenities, let's say, and what you put in there, and plus your location may not be the most ideal. You still could build that.
Through there, yes, you could build it, but yes, the quality and the final end product would be significantly less. To give you an example, buildings built in the 146 to 170 mark, that's typically what you see up on Columbia Street. So they're big boxes. They might have some cladding on the bottom two floors, and then it's EIFS up to the top. My own opinion is that's not the type of quality that I think our community is looking for downtown, but that's the kind of building that you could potentially build downtown and potentially be profitable.
Okay, I agree, and there is that potential there. The 3-year tax exemption, based on your report, there were no projects that were approved that took benefit of this? I found that as a surprise. I thought there was a few. I don't know.
Through the chair, there may have been. All I could go back to is what was on record really when we started documenting electronically, and we didn't find any paper notes. So there may have been ones that probably in the late 90s probably took advantage of this, but certainly from whatever records I could access, I couldn't see any projects that had used it, whether that's we weren't publicizing it very well or what the reason was. We couldn't find any ones that...
Okay. And I know you're going to be eliminating it, so I don't want to belabor that, but just more curiosity. The next aspect is the building permit rebates, and you're going to be modifying this, as you indicated. Right now you mentioned there's funding is limited. What is it limited to? What's the dollar sign right now?
Through the chair, it's not limited per project. It's limited by what's in the capital budget.
That's what I mean. What is that figure?
We probably have about $900,000 because it's a capital budget, so it accrues. We have about $900,000 available, and there's about $80,000 that gets put in every year. So at the end of this year, we could have roughly $1 million. The big projects, they like a One Victoria and City Centre, those two projects alone would probably eat up that entire budget.
Right.
That's how much those permits are cost. So it may seem like a lot of money, but in fact, it's actually an underfunded program for those types of major developments.
So basically, you want to take it and give it to the lower guy who's got the small little development and get his money, $1,000, $2,000 back, whatever. That's what the intent is. Okay, I appreciate that. Parkland dedication. How much money have we lost since 1995 on this exemption?
Through the chair, I would have to go back and look. Since 1995, probably not that many. I mean, the biggest one would have been that new apartment building at Queen and Weber would have been the main contributor, and I think there's roughly 200 units in there. And depending on whether we're asking for the full amount or not, so you give me 2 quick seconds, I can potentially tell you. So for a building like that, for example, the Parkland waiver is about $1,800 a unit. That's at a more urban rate. So 1,800 times 200 units, that's the amount of dollars that we would have lost do the math in my head, but
3.6
Monday
million?
morning. And yeah, so that would probably be the main project, and Le Marché would have been the other one. I'm not sure. I'd have to look to see whether Kaufman would, because it was a building within existing space, whether that would have.
Well,
they would be required
I'm
to
glad
pay or
this
not.
is going to be eliminated in that, I mean, we're talking about funding for parks and trails, and then yet we give exemptions on this, and then you want to build, but you don't got no money coming in. So you can't be speaking to both sides of your mouth if you want to make progress on this. I'm glad that's going to change. Exemptions to development charges. And you made your analysis, and I understand where you're coming from on that. The question I have is that there's a component from the city, which is about $3,000 plus the portion from the region, which is $9,000. You want to modify this. What's going to happen with the region? Are they on board, or are they still going to provide it, or are they going to follow what the city wants to do? What's their objective?
Through the chair, we've had discussions with their staff. I would suggest that their planning staff, their intent is to continue to follow what we're doing. I would say their finance staff, are wrestling with the same issues we are. How do you continue to fund it? So I would say that the sentiment is not necessarily equal. So we do need to continue to engage the region at all levels to determine what their actual final position would be.
I'm sorry, say the last part again?
We clearly need to
sort
stay
of faded
engaged
there.
because it's not their entire, it hasn't been a direction of council yet, and there hasn't been a decision of their council on which way to go, and their staff aren't necessarily entirely in agreement with the way we would proceed.
Okay. Next one is the upper story renovation program. You said there was, what, $600,000 available? Or what? Yeah, that was you.
Through the chair, when that program was established, I think there was roughly $1 million that was put into it, and through those 6 projects, it equated to about $400,000. So there was $600,000 that hadn't been spent out of that program yet.
So what's going to happen to that money? You're going to transfer it to somewhere else?
Through the chair, what we've suggested is if we develop a landing pad program, we would use that money to finance that program.
So if you go to the landing pad grant program, and then I'm looking at your overall evaluation, which you had this chart with the S's and O's. Remember that one?
Mm-hmm.
And you have those 6 programs, and the landing pad program is a new one, which should be a 7th.
Right.
How does that fit in terms of easy to administer? Easy or not easy to administer? I gathered it looked quite complicated.
Through the chair, if we offered that program the same way we offered the upper story renovation program, because they're fairly similar, it's just a different use. It's really both targeted at the second and third floor space. Just instead of residential, we're looking at these landing pads. The way we offered the upper story program was both a grant and a loan. Grants are very easy to administer. Loans are extremely time-consuming and difficult and costly to administer. So what we're suggesting is if we developed a landing pad program, we would not include the loan portion of that. We would simply include it as a grant, which is far more easy to administer. It would be similar to the facade grant program, which is fairly straightforward to administer.
Okay. And my final question pertains to the correspondence from Jennifer Voss from Activa in regard to her concern and comments on the calculation of the parkland cash in lieu, and that if you've got X number of units in smaller sizes versus a larger building, even though the same building could be the same, the smaller the units, the greater the contribution. Yet the building's still the same. You still got 20 stories. You still got 1 million square feet, whatever it is, but you contribute 3 times as much if you've got 3 times as many units. Are you going to be looking at modifying that in terms of a different calculation to balance it out versus larger units, which are probably more expensive and affordable, whereby the other ones are more starter level?
Through the chair, it's certainly something we can look at through a review, but the Planning Act limits us to the calculation typically has to be per unit, and as opposed to a sliding scale depending on the size of units or the number of units. But it's certainly something we can look into. I'm not hopeful that we'll have the ability to do what you're suggesting.
Right, okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Mayor Czar.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks for the report, and I think that this is probably one of the more comprehensive reports that we've had in terms of this issue for many, many years. So, and I appreciate your comment as well about so many people that had worked on it. Just a few questions. 79 Joseph, that's where Treehouse is now, the old Hydro House, is that correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay. And if I'm also correct, what is part of the recommendations at this point in time, or the entire set of recommendations, is that it is no change to the budget requirements. Is that also correct?
Through the chair, that's correct. Based on what we're suggesting, there would be no additional funding required to finance these. We would be using existing funds.
Okay. Next, each one of the incentives, you had some calculations to obviously back up your recommendation. Unless I missed it, I don't see sort of an overall chart that would say what the cost or revenue calculations are for all of this. You were doing it based on a per unit and an incentive, a specific incentive. Right. Is there a summary of that you did?
Through the chair, so if you were to take all of the potential costs to the city for all of these programs, what does that look like? Is that what you're...
Yes. Or is it basically what is in our budget?
Through the chair, it's essentially, with the exception of the DC waiver, all of the other programs are subject to funding. So whatever's in the budget is all we can spend, and we can cap it. The development charge waiver as it exists today is the one open-ended program where basically, if we don't make changes to the program, every single time a project comes forward, we have to find a way to finance those waivers. So that one, if you were to add up all of the major projects, that could be a significant price tag with what's in the queue right now.
Okay, so that becomes a cost, an additional cost to the city, only if, as and when, we have downtown projects, capital projects, that would otherwise have been included in the DC.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And just checking my questions. So on a go-forward basis now, and actually you did speak to part of this with another question when you were talking about the discussion you had with the home builders. But so what have been those discussions, and what will be those discussions continuing on between now and September when you come back with this report in order to get the public input? Have you planned anything specific, or are you hoping for our views and then also getting some additional comments from the sector or the public in general?
Through the chair, with the exception of the discussion with the home builders, which just for scheduling reasons was after this meeting, we've essentially completed all of our consultation with stakeholders in the community. Not to say that other comments won't come in or we won't receive more, but if we receive more, we'll certainly comment back. We made sure to meet with all of the major downtown stakeholders that we thought had an interest, and we've done that, and most of those stakeholders are in agreement with our approach, and in fact they made the point that if it wasn't for these incentives, the likelihood of them carrying forward with their projects now would be much less. It's probably stating it mildly, they probably wouldn't do them if we didn't have these incentives, was sort of the point they made to me. So beyond the discussion with the stakeholder, with the home builders, which is essentially to gauge the reaction from typical suburban home builders as opposed to the more urban developers that we typically deal with.
Appreciate that.
That's probably about the only outstanding commentary that we'll receive between then and now.
Okay. So my comments, Mr. Chairman, I think you're asking for them both at the same time as questions. Yes. I am supportive of what is being recommended. It took me a while to get my head around all of the nuances here, but what I like about it is that it does not change the budget requirement, but sort of customizes the incentive programs that we do have and customizes the use of the funds that are in our budget to make them more relative to what the marketplace is today. And in terms of the potential risk in the future, that significant downtown projects would have to compete with, would no longer have DC funding, I think that's probably appropriate as well. So it will simply compete with everything else in our capital budget. So it's a level playing field in that respect. So I will be supporting the recommendations as they are now. I recognize that today we're not asking for, or at least the staff is not asking for approval, but as I see it now, my inclination when it comes back would be to be supportive of it. Certainly today I will support the recommendation that is in front of us.
Thank you. Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you. Thank you for this interesting read. I have to say that it was an awful lot to sort of chow through and understand, especially with all the different incentive programs. I'm sort of going to start from the community engagement component first, because that's always been a big issue for me. When I read about the community engagement, I do feel, and in reviewing the 3 letters that we received, I think that when you're talking about interested stakeholders and developers, you're talking about really only the people who are here right now, building, working in the downtown, have businesses. I think you are missing the general public. I think the general public needs to understand, because I've heard over and over and over again that we are not paying attention to issues in the suburban areas. We've got all kinds of plazas, and I see it so often because when you bike around the community, you see the missing teeth. You see all of the gaps. And plazas that are sitting half empty are not an incentive for businesses to come. Mm-hmm. And they're not an incentive for residents to go to those businesses. Not everybody is going to come downtown. And we need to ask our general public, whether it's a budget implication or not. So my question is, how can we engage the general public? They need to understand. I mean, it's their money we're playing with here. Yeah. So, if you're saying September is when you want us to support this, I think it's too soon. This process has taken place through the entire summer, when a lot of the general public is on holidays. So I'd like to know how we can engage the general public and get their comments. I think it's very important.
Through the chair, this is probably in my career the 3rd or 4th time I've gone through it and either brought an incentive program forward or done a review. And the nature of this type of work typically gets very little community response, whether that's because of the complexity or what the issue may be. Typically, we don't get a lot of community feedback from the general public. Not saying that's a good thing. That's just what we've experienced today. I think if what I'm understanding from your comment about, if I'm understanding right, is should we be considering offering incentives for strip plazas or other areas outside the downtown, and would the residents welcome that or not? That's a much bigger question, and I think that could be potentially handled through an upcoming Compass Kitchener survey, for example, if they were to ask a question of, would you support incentives being offered in your neighborhood that are geared towards assisting the plaza? I think those types of questions are questions we could ask. In terms of getting the general public's input on these incentives, there's always things we can do, but we've typically found that they just typically don't understand the issues, no matter how easy we try to make it, and it becomes challenging to get feedback. So we're certainly open to doing that. I should say that when we bring projects forward in the implementation stage, all of them are done through, there's a regimented public process that we have to go through. We can certainly, through those processes, think of ways to try to make it understandable for the general public to provide feedback, if that's the desire. Again, my history has told me that the public generally doesn't get engaged in this kind of a discussion.
Mr. Aguirre, you wanted to add?
Yeah, just to add to Corey's statement, we have had questions about the importance of the downtown on our in our various polling processes, our Environics surveys, the Compass Kitchener work, and through all of those processes, the public has very clearly told us that the downtown is a strategic issue for the city, that it's important for the city to invest in. We have had very strong levels of support for the continued investment that we've made in the downtown. I would add that the downtown is not just another part of the city. It's the largest employment area in the city. We have over 12,000 people working in the city. Most of those people live outside in suburban areas of the community, and commute into work. So it's a part of the city that serves the entire whole. And I guess the third point I'd like to make is that the bulk of the city's capital budget actually does go towards the larger project. This is the city's capital funding, and I believe we did some work on this a little while ago. I can't remember the exact outcome of this, but certainly the downtown is not disproportionately served through the city's capital program at this point.
Okay, thank you. That begs to another question, which I will answer after my list of other questions. I see that the media is here, and I'm hoping that the media will cover this in a way that will encourage citizens to come out, whether it's through emails to their councillors or to our staff. I think it's very important that they have some kind of input. I think it's not... It bothers me a little bit, gentlemen, when you say typically, and I think we're underestimating the interest in our community, given what Mr. Aguirre said with regard to surveys and Compass Kitchener. Other questions I have is, I guess in a way, Mr. Aguirre answered my question about what is the benefit to the average taxpayer who lives outside of the core on the work that's happening in downtown. Do you have another answer outside of what Mr. Aguirre was talking about with regards to employees that are working in the downtown core? I can see that as a fairly obvious response. They have a place to go for lunch. They have a place to see some entertainment while they're working here, but once they leave the downtown core, many of them don't come back. So how would you sell this to the average taxpayer?
Before you start, Mr. Aguirre, do you want to finish your thought on that first?
Well, I would just to respond to that issue or that question. The downtown is a resource for the entire city. Just this weekend, we saw, tens of thousands of people coming into the downtown, filling the streets completely. We see that happening for multiple events throughout the course of the year. Cruising on King, our multicultural festival, Word on the Street, our various parades, and so on. So the downtown is really a resource for the entire community, in addition to the largest single employment district in the community. But what we're seeing now is that the downtown has become iconic for some of the fastest growing components of our economy. Particularly for our startup and technology companies. And the downtown, I can tell you, is receiving notice around, across North America as a place for the growth, to support the growth of some of the most innovative companies anywhere. These companies are laying the foundation for our economy. They're employing our youth. They're generating high-value, creative occupations, and they're helping us respond as a region to the challenges in our economy as a whole. So I think it's a strategic asset for the city, and it's having a significant impact on what kind of a region, what kind of economy we're living in.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the things that I'm was looking at, and this was because I was looking at our budget review, which is the next agenda item, is and given, notwithstanding the fact that Mayor Zayer mentioned that this has no budget implications in terms of where the money is presently coming from, we are below our assessment growth, and I guess this is sort of a double-edged sword when I ask this question, because if we're below our assessment growth, you would think that I would be saying, great, let's go, let's get some more assessment growth in the downtown and do whatever we can. But we are below, we were at 0.7%, and Mr. Chapman, correct me if I'm incorrect, if it was 0.7 assessment growth at this point, which is about 0.8% less than where we were last year. If we don't see this increased interest in building residential properties, we're not going to increase our assessment growth, therefore we're not going to have the dollars to move forward on anything in our budget. Yep. So I kind of see that we're taking with one hand and giving with another on something that may not come to fruition. Some of these incentives didn't work. How are you believing that some of these other going? I mean, you're talking mainly incentives for business, but the incentives, I guess, that we would want to see would be ones that would increase our assessment growth on rentals and condos and such.
Sorry, Councillor Fernandez, can I just get you to, well, first, just to be clear as well, last year our assessment growth was 0.6 higher than our projections, which is significant. It was about,
my numbers that I have.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm just saying that the assessment projection now isn't really entirely focused. Like by the end of the year, like we're targeting 1%, and there's a very high likelihood by the end of the year we'll be closer to that 1%.
I understand.
But if you could just, sorry, I don't really understand the question, though. If you could just rephrase the understanding what the tie-in is.
I think Corey understood. He was nodding.
Do you? Okay, go ahead.
Sure. The way I would answer it is whether it's a true cost or foregone revenue, we don't actually experience that until building permit time when the actual permits are issued. So as long as nothing happens, it's not a cost. And then I would, in terms of growth, I'd revert back to that one chart I showed you, which basically suggests for the value of an incentive that we're talking about here, once you're beyond, say, 6 years of post-occupancy, so that building has existed for 6 years, that's brand new tax assessment that doesn't exist today. And in fact, you basically have from occupancy on that you would have new tax assessment, but as I said, there's sort of that 6-year window where it'll take you that long to recoup what was given out through an incentive. So, if you took a 20-year perspective and you had significant development growth, yes, there's going to be a 5 or 6 year window where technically you're not really gaining any ground, but beyond that 6 years, you've got a lifetime of new assessment to fit in the budget. So I don't know if that answers your...
Yes, it kind of does, but I guess you're sort of helping me form my question with regard to how long it's going to take for some of this payback, which is 6 years in some, 5.37 in others. Is that the general standard of payback? I mean, I guess that's really a difficult question to answer. But if you're looking at other cities, comparatively to other municipalities that are roughly the size that we are, is incentive programs paying back quicker or longer?
Through the chair, it really depends on different communities. Brantford, for example, they offer significantly more in terms of incentives than we do, and they probably have a much smaller post-development assessment. So for them, there's the payback is probably far more significant than ours. I would say most cities are like London and cities of our size, it's probably going to be comparable in terms of the amount of incentive they're offering relative to the amount of assessment growth they would expect to get. It's just so then it becomes a question: is 6 years a good number of time before you really see a true return, I guess, on the investment, if you want to call it that.
Okay, thank you. Going to the parkland dedication and having sat on the Kitchener Environmental Committee, I remember very distinctly one of the action points and requests that came out of the air quality report was to actually increase the parkland dedication. That 2% for businesses was pretty low. And just going to what Councillor Yanetsky was saying, why are we not, per unit, if the building mass is the same, some are paying higher. And I would suggest to Councillor Yanetsky that it's because there are more people. And the more people really equals really what more green space we need. As we intensify, my understanding is that we really need more green space. So I would really not support a reduction in parkland dedication. I think that the pressure on Victoria Park, it's an amazing area, but Parkette does not fulfill the need for people who are living in an apartment building or a condo development. So I don't understand why we would reduce it. I think it's really much more important to at least stay the course in terms of a 2%.
Through the chair, and again, we didn't get into detail in this report, but I suspect when we come back with a more comprehensive review of the parkland dedication policy, if we were to ask for the full amount that the Planning Act allows us, depending on, and it varies depending on the value of the land, which is sort of what it's all contingent upon, that could escalate upwards of $8,000 or $9,000 per unit, which would essentially have the effect of negating any other incentives we're offering. So it could come as an encumbrance and actually prohibit development if we ask for the full amount that we're allowed to ask for. So I think what we're trying to determine is what's an appropriate rate. If 100% is probably going to stifle development, what's the right percentage for these projects that we can collect some money, but we're still not stifling development, and that's the challenge. So I think, we'll do much more detailed work on that as we were to bring that forward. We've suggested that a 0.15, sort of 15% makes sense, but we'll do a much more comprehensive analysis on that when we bring that forward.
Okay.
Just to clarify, if I could as well, but right now we're collecting zero.
Right.
Okay, so we are actually increasing it. When you said stay the course, I wanted to make sure you understood not the recommendation, but in this plan here, if we do end up doing it, would be increasing it to 15% of what we would otherwise do.
That's correct.
So I guess I'm a little bit confused. My understanding was that we collected 2%.
Through the chair, not downtown. Downtown right now, we don't
Zero.
collect anything. So we're suggesting we actually would add we'd actually collect money moving forward. So it's a question of what's that amount.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that because I think that's really crucial to. I think any study that you would read regarding the quality of life for people who are living in intensive buildings with no green space except for maybe a balcony pot, they really need to be out and have the ability to connect in trails and parks and such.
Yep.
Okay. I'm just a little bit concerned, and maybe help me understand. You were talking about the pre-2009, I wrote down here, cut a hole in the bylaw, developers don't pay development charge fee, which I think is a little bit risky if it means that we won't have money for future capital projects. We're always hearing that our infrastructure is crumbling. We need to, Margaret Avenue Bridge is a perfect example. If we don't, that's a downtown bridge. If we don't have the money to fix those kind of things because we're not collecting DC charges from downtown development or any development within the downtown core, where are we going to get the money?
Through the chair, I just want to clarify that you can only go to the development charge fund for growth-related capital projects. So maintenance typically, so just to resurface a road or fix a bridge that's aging, typically has to come out of the capital budget as opposed to the development charge budget. So it's really just infrastructure improvements to accommodate, intensification, for example. So, in our look forward over the next, term of the bylaw, we don't see many growth-related infrastructure needs in the downtown. Not to say that there won't be maintenance needs, perhaps, but not any growth-related, just to clarify.
Okay, thanks for helping me understand that a bit better. I'm just holding off on talking about the landing pad issue because I do feel that requires a few more minutes of everybody's time. What if we can put a number on what we have been doing in terms of all of these incentives? Do we have a sort of a total budget? Mayor Zayer said it has no budget ramifications because we're shifting monies from programs that we've used in the past, and maybe I missed it in the report. I apologize if I did. What's the total dollars that we've been using for these programs or spent out for these programs that we're now going to be shifting? Is there a ability to put?
Through the chair, yes, we could calculate that. I can give you a rough idea that facade grant program, for example, that was a one-time set of funding for $600,000. So we expect by the end of this year that would be exhausted. And just for some context, that leveraged about $1.8 million in private sector dollars, so pretty much our dollar was only a quarter of the full amount. But that program was $600,000. The building permit rebate, again, it's a capital line item that's about $80,000 a year, and it accrues. So it's a little harder because we don't. It really gets exhausted as a big project comes forward. So it's not like we see a similar amount of money being paid out of that every year.
Okay, Corey, I'm going to interrupt you because I see where you're having to try and juggle all of this. Yeah. So maybe it would be better if you could sure. Send something to council, yep. Because you've got a per year cost here, and then you've got an overall budget, and it's going to. I don't want to waste your time, yep. and council's time on that. So if sure. you can send that to us, that would probably be a lot better. Okay. Going to the landing pad. Given the information that Mr. Greer has given us, and the excitement about us being such a great startup city and Communitech and such forth, interesting conversation I had with somebody who started up a company not that long ago, who continues to struggle just as a startup, and they're in fairly decent space, and they're accessible. I'm really concerned with the concept of us giving a 50% grant. I think that's significant dollars in investing in businesses that we're not sure are going to survive. Right now, we're looking at an 8% unemployment rate, which, if we're having all of these incentives and all these startups and all these new businesses that are starting up every single day, then why are we faced with an 8% unemployment rate? So I think that although I understand the philosophy, I think that we're looking at quite a significant dollar to start up these startups. My question is, where would the general public or the general taxpayer see a benefit to these landing pads? Yes, they could employ some people. They could maybe help reduce that unemployment rate. But
Mr. Regier?
Yeah, certainly. 3 years ago, Vidyard was an idea of two students from University of Waterloo. We supported them through the Waterloo Region Small Business Center through the Communitech program. They went to California. They received some Series A funding from key investors in California. Today, they're over 30 employees and growing exponentially. And I understand they've got 1 million users of their technology online. We see startups like Kik growing exponentially. We see companies like Thalmic Labs, which was a startup out of the University of Waterloo Velocity program at the Communitech Hub. Again, 2 or 3 students, engineering students from the university. Today, they're 25 or 30, going to 75 by the end of the year. So these are companies which are doubling their employment every 6 months, every 12 months right now. This is where BlackBerry was in the early 1990s. This is where at one time Manulife would have been, or Electrohome. So what we're funding here are the embryos of companies that can become major employers and major tax generators for our community. The long-term benefits of having one of the most exciting entrepreneurial ecosystems in the country is that we will continue to generate growth and employment and future tax revenue at sustainable rates into the future. This is really the foundation of the renewal of our economy.
Okay, thank you for that. And I guess you've eliminated another question for me, but I guess I'll go to my comments. I realize that I've commented throughout with my questions, and I appreciate that. You know, the companies that you mentioned, RIM and Electrohome and Kunz Electroplating, all of those companies built their business on what the market would bear and how the market would grow. I don't know, and maybe you know, if they had incentives. I don't know that it's necessarily a good thing for us to always incent businesses. I think sometimes we have to let businesses fail because the market will not bear that particular product or that item or whatever. That's the competitive nature of business. If we continue to babysit some of these, some of them may hang on for much, much longer than they would because they're getting an incentive program. I do really struggle with a 50% incentive. I think that's really, really dangerous. So I would definitely not support that component. I'm not even sure that I would support a whole landing pad incentive period. But I realize that there seems to be quite an appetite around the council chambers to do that. I guess that would remain to see. My question, I guess, is leading to a question instead. Are we expected to vote on that component today, or just to have you continue, according to this, consider expecting the community improvement plan boundary to include, sorry, that's out of context. Develop a grant program for the landing pad geared towards the startup business. So this is part of what you're wanting us to approve today.
Through the chair, in September, we would be coming back, based on the various comments, we'll come back, we'll revise this list of recommendations accordingly, and in September you'd be approving these, but that's really just giving us direction to start the process of developing a community improvement plan, which requires at least one more council approval, if not multiple ones, and it requires public engagement and everything else. So you're just really giving us direction to explore it. For example, even with the process, it would be probably after Christmas before we would actually be able to have a program ready for you guys to actually approve or not approve. So there's still significant time to go. I might add just one point of clarification, because I know it's not explicitly clear. What we're talking about investing in is the physical space more so than the actual business. While the business is part of it, it's really money to go into the renovation of upper story space. And part of the discussions we've had is making sure that those renovations happen in such a way that if that company only lasts 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, that it's suitable for another company to come in after the fact. So we see it more as an ability to facilitate the renovation of upper story space, which we've seen a history of fires that can take it from worrisome state to state that hopefully, whether that company succeeds or not, is available to another company.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that. That's very important. Okay, that's all my comments right now, and
thank you.
We'll go from there. Thanks.
Councillor Glenn Graham.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I do appreciate the hard work and that this is the first opportunity for feedback. I want to ask about the upper story program and about accessibility, and see the chief here as well about the fire code, about our review of that, because we need to get it right. If we're going to do this, go down this path, I know that these are difficult spaces, but I want to make sure that we're looking at it holistically. So can you respond to that?
Sure. Through the chair, if not for our upper story loan program that we offered, those 6 projects probably wouldn't have gone ahead. It was those projects that motivated the building owners to say, I can take these upper floors that most of which were sitting vacant, and to actually turn them into new units that are to the standard of the code of that time. So certainly, I mean, I think we just got to a point with that program where we realized that there wasn't interest from the existing building owners for residential. So this is another opportunity to look at the same kind of concept, but with a different use. I think it's one of those things that we can always revisit. One of the options is we don't necessarily need to eliminate the upper story program. We can just provide no funding to it, and it basically sits dormant. But we could, if we saw demand and if it was council's appetite to do that again, it's just a matter of finding the funding for that. So that is an option that we could carry forward.
I mean, I'm certainly very supportive of the landing pad concept. I just want to make sure that we have looked at these kinds of elements of it. In terms of the $3.5 million in the total pot, how much is committed or either on stream or future projects?
Give me 1 second. Through the chair, a good portion of that is committed. For example, there's 1.5 million set aside to fund the development charge waivers. A portion of that is committed through the development agreement with City Centre. Beyond that, nothing is committed because we don't actually have any developments in place. If we were to say we're no longer going to offer those exemptions ever again, and we started that today, for example, then it wouldn't cost us anything, but we would have a lot of developers that would probably not be very happy and would probably walk away from their projects. So there's that inherent risk. So beyond that, I think the other, with the exception of the facade program, which is fully allocated, all of the other programs are of that sort of nature. There's money sitting there. We know there are projects that they've made their decisions to go ahead based on those being available. So if we were to take those away, then we would have to deal with the ramifications of that.
No, I'm certainly not looking to take anything away. I just wanted to see if there was any consideration given for that envelope to accommodate a larger fusion building kind of project. Right. And just moving to that topic, on 439 to 442, I think, it talks about the potential business case for that and a payback that would be, I'm not sure of the price per unit, but about 3 to 4.5 years for payback, with a potential of about $518,000 a year of revenue to the city, certainly after that. And you talked about the business case yourself, Corey, about the return on investment after the city recoups its investment. So if you could speak to that today, and then briefly, and perhaps bring something back in writing about the business case on the number of units, the investment of the city in total, the payback, and because I think expanding the boundary to the east end makes sense, not only for the potential for this development, but the indirect benefits that it brings to the east end for generating confidence in that area, also the market, and elevating the value of properties in that whole area.
So through the chairs, so what I'm understanding is if I were to take down to Betzner and look at basically the 6 blocks that are included, suggest what a full build out would look like, what the assessment would look like on that, and then what assuming that those are all built with this sort of incentive model, what the cost is to the city.
Thank you. I mean, really, Fusion Homes is the one concrete example on the table we have, and I think that's the one that bears looking at very seriously, because it does potentially anchor the east end that really could use that investment. So I really appreciate that coming back. I don't expect you would have all that now, but I really think that it bears looking at in serious detail. And just briefly as a comment, I do believe in the direction we're going in. I do think that we're really supporting the current investment of the downtown is paying off. And I think the way to support not only our investment in creating jobs, but also the confidence in the city as a whole is to continue in this direction. I do agree with a holistic review of all our incentives, though, as Councillor Fernandez suggested. I do think the downtown still needs incentives, and I think post-LRT would be a perfect opportunity to review them 3 years out. In terms of the landing pad itself, I don't think that it's something that could be sustained without the investment. And right now, I think that the conclusion we have to draw is that these small businesses are the ones that are looking for space. As you said, Corey, these incentives are not going directly to the businesses. They're going to create the right conditions for success. And I think that's the role of our government at this level, is to continue to create the right conditions for prosperity. And I think that this is certainly supportive of that. So I would support the whole package we're looking at, with the exception of potentially looking at expanding the boundary in the east end of the city to, as Fusion suggested, to the Betzner area, but that's discussion for a later day. Thank you.
Just back to Councillor Fernandez for finish of thought.
Thank you. I appreciate your indulgence. I probably should have been a little bit clearer on my request for the information about the budget and what was being spent. If you can explain to us or show us what was maybe spent in this budget of 2013 and what's expected in the budget for these programs maybe moved forward. It would still be the same amount, however we shift the funding. So I just want to make sure that was a little bit clearer for you. And the other was a request that maybe we not see this in September, but maybe push it a little bit into October, so that should there be any input coming in from the general public, that we allow that to happen.
Sure.
Thank you.
Councillor Gazzola.
I have a number of questions, but I'll try to be quick because I guess we're quite a bit over already.
Appreciate it.
I want to expand on those two things too. I would like to see a summary for the last 15 years of what we have spent on incentive programs. I think that's something that we should have in front of us as we move forward, so we can compare to see where we have been. And also, I'm also concerned about the September timelines. This is pretty involved, and I'm hearing here that the public don't understand the issues here, and I think they need to, because the bottom line is the money is coming from where? It's not coming from heaven. The bottom line is the money is coming from the public, and the public, if they don't understand, we haven't done a very good job of explaining where we're going, and we need to do that in the next few months before we finalize all these things. So I wanted to, if you could switch your screen there to what's on page 12, I really want to try to understand who gets the benefits of all of these things. And you had a schedule there, the comparison.
Sorry, Councillor Gazzola, page 12 on the page 12 of the report,
Yeah,
or
page 12
4-12?
or page 419 or
419.
or whatever. What I'm trying to drive at, do some of these benefits go directly to, like this 3-year tax exemption? Does that go to the person that owns the unit?
Through the chair, typically, it can go either way, but typically it goes to the developer. So so for example, the person who buys the unit pays the taxes over those 3 years. That money, though, we collect it and then we essentially give it as a grant to the developer.
Okay,
I haven't seen it in a case where they would actually give the benefit to the purchaser.
Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Most of these benefits, the cash flows to the developer. Doesn't the homeowner doesn't really see any of this directly up front. Okay. One of the questions is, do you know of any municipality that allows a full parkland benefit?
As in a full waiver or a full asking the full rate?
No, that allows the full amount as allowed by the Planning Act.
Through the chair, in an urban downtown context, again, don't quote me on this, I don't know the exact answer, but from what I understand, only the major GTA municipalities are asking the full amount. So Toronto, for example, and Mississauga. Again, I don't know if this is exactly the case, but I've heard that Oakville uses it actually as an intensification deterrent. So they actually apply the full rate because they don't want to see more big-scale development in their court. Whether that's the case or not, that's just what I heard from a colleague. But by and large, most, I would guess, if I looked into it, most municipalities offer partial, if not full, waiver of their parkland fees in the downtown if they've got an incentive program like ours.
Okay. When you're preparing that summary of the incentives that we have paid out, will you include in that what incentives that we gave to the city center?
Yes, we can.
I want to try to get a good understanding here of on the DC funding. If we go in the direction that you're recommending, who's finally paying the bill for this stuff?
Through the chair, essentially nobody is paying the bill. The risk for us is that if there is a growth-related expense that we have to pay for in the next term of that bylaw, that has to come from the capital budget as opposed to the development charge budget. So in essence, it's the taxpayer paying for it as opposed to the developer paying for it, if that makes sense.
Yes, it is the taxpayer. That's where it always comes down to the taxpayer. Just on that, you often talk about things that come from the region. They're free. Well, they really come from the other taxpayer's pocket, right? So they're not free. We need to understand that.
Through the chair, yes, I would never refer to that as a free.
No, but you sort of indicate that, we don't have to worry about that. That comes from the region. We get a lot of things from the region. One of the questions I had is, where can I get some objective information about our startups? I hear a lot of information, which I would call more marketing than really objective information. How do where can one really find, if they wanted to dig into it, what is the real impact of our startups?
Mr. Aguirre?
Communitech released a study by KPMG this spring outlining the economic impact of its work at the Communitech Hub, and we can forward you the link to that study.
Fine, thank you. Okay, I don't have, I have a number of other questions, but I think that they'll come out over time. I am concerned about public engagement. We had a public information meeting on July the 17th, right dead in the middle of the summer. Because let's face it, the bottom line on all of this is the taxpayer.
Mhm.
There's no gray-haired grandfather out there paying the bill. It's the taxpayer. I'm not prepared to support anything of where we're going, where staff is looking at. I'm prepared to look at the alternative number 5 that says that we get out of the incentive business. And I do it for a number of reasons. I think, you started right off the fact by saying our community, the downtown, is different from today from 1995. There's a big difference. So we've done a great deal in the downtown, and we've spent a lot of money in the downtown. I'm especially concerned about DC funds. We're in bad shape with our DC funds. And the more fiddling we do with this, the worse shape we're going to be in. I would have, in dealing with this, if the DC funds are going to be an integral part of it, if you take your direction from me, they won't be, but if that's the choice that you go, we need to know the exact picture of our DC funds, because they're currently in bad shape. We're in the process of, we're going to have to be going out, out next year with new figures. We need to have some good concept of what those figures are. So that's one of the reasons I think it's time that we got away from this. The bottom line is, whatever we do with the DC funds are intended for the new people coming to town to pay to enter, to get into partnership with us. And this is not happening. We're throwing the bill back to the old people that have been here for 50 years paying their taxes. So we have to have a good look at that. We have spent huge amounts of money in the downtown in the last 15 years. When I look around the city, and the downtown is important. There's no question it's important. It's the base. But, we have to start spending some money on the other rooms in the house too. And when I hear incidents where there are things that we should be doing as a municipality, we keep saying, we don't have the budget, we can't afford it. And yet we're spending in the downtown. The downtown is part of the city. It's an important part of the city. Yes, we all converge in the downtown from time to time, but there's a lot to this city. The ward that I represent, when it comes to even forgetting residential, dealing on a commercial basis, the ward that I represent, there is a humongous amount of assessment, commercial, industrial assessment that comes into this city. When I look at the Fairview area, when I look down now in the area at Deer Ridge on Highway 8, there's a substantial amount of new assessment coming into the city without any incentives. They've had to do that. When I look around the city, I look at the Belmont area, for example, another large area, a lot of commerce in the city. Again, it's being done without all these incentives. So when it comes to the landing pad, I think that's a great idea. Great ideas. The problem is municipalities don't have the tax base that senior governments have. This sort of thing comes under the mandate of our federal and provincial governments. They should be taking a much greater lead in this than we're, we're stepping in as we did with, in so many cases with education, which isn't our mandate, and we're forking out the bill. And that's all coming back to our taxpayers. One of the other concerns that I have, and we're going to start to see the impact of this, is very shortly, there's going to be quite an impact on the people that currently work at Schneider's. I get emails, and I'm sure you all do from time to time, about what are we doing for those people? I've had several of them write and say, are you going to give me $40,000 to get started up into something now? I think we know what the answer is. So in conclusion, I think you've done an excellent job in putting all the facts on the table. You've done a lot of homework. You've done prepared a lot of information, which even begs sometimes more information. And I think it's good that we look at this, but I think the time has come that we have to start looking away from it and counting on the fruits of our past labor to move things forward. And I think you said right from the start, it's a different city, so the fruits from our past labor are paying off. I think we got to rely more on that than continuing with these incentive programs. Thank you.
Thank you. I have just two questions. Many of them have talked about in EDAC. With respect to the LRT, when this comes back, assuming that the stimulus that comes from the LRT implementation, that some of these incentives are no longer required, is the plan that these incentives can be yanked by a future council or on relatively short notice?
To the chair, I think the intent is we will review, do this same exact analysis, probably leading up to the end of the next development charge bylaw period, so probably about 4 years from now. And certainly that's the thought process of staff, is that we would review whether we think we need these incentives or not, much like we did in this case. We review the economics and determine, are we ready to fully get out of the incentive business or not. So that is the intent. Again, can't foresee what the answer is, but we'll certainly be studying it.
Okay, thank you. And on the landing pad, now, I don't want to get into too much detail, but the way I foresee it working then is it wouldn't actually, I'm not sure how you actually tie the startup business in, because the agreement would have to be with the owner of the space that they go in. So my concern is how you're going to tie the actual startup business, and I guess I'm worried about it being an end run for private landlords to get their places renovated and then end up not getting startups in there. How can we get around that?
Through the chair, again, those are details that we're still working through, but in essence, we would have an agreement with the building owner that they could only rent to businesses which satisfy certain criteria, and that we would withhold portions of that grant. For example, if we had a 5-year window and we want to make sure that over the next 5 years that was used for startups, then we don't give them all of the money until that has been satisfied. So that is the thought process, but we haven't exactly worked out what that mechanics is, but there would be some leverage that we have to make sure that those spaces are used for the intended users.
Okay. Commenting briefly, I agree. I don't think, especially in light of recent reports about unemployment in the region, I don't think now is the time to cut back on incentives. I wouldn't be in support if there was any sort of budget impact. The fact that it's revenue neutral, I think is appropriate. I do think there is going to be a time in the not too distant future when the rapid transit implementation should, by all accounts, help in our ability to remove these incentives and possibly reprioritize the dollars to places that we could use them elsewhere in the city. Sensitive to the fact, obviously, that the downtown has received significant investment compared to the outlying parts of the city, and I look forward to the day when the engine downtown starts operating itself. I don't think that time is just yet. I think it's in the very near future that we need to start clawing back those incentives. But I'm very happy to see this before us. In particular, while there's still some details to be worked out, I think the landing pad idea is great, because if there's one thing that's frustrating for all the work that we do with startups, it's right at the point when they start to become viable, sustainable, that's when they often decide to leave the region, and it's because there isn't a program like this in place. So there'll be some challenges in terms of marketing, in terms of getting this information out there to the potential startups, but I think it's a very good starting program. So, Councillor Verbanovich, you moved it. Do you want to comment?
Thank you. If I can, Mr. Chair, just move it and just make a couple comments, because I think they are important to make. And in moving the recommendation, I think the direction that staff have received has been the comments that a number of councillors have made of additional information that we'd like to see, and also the fact that we think it's appropriate to take a little bit of additional time in consulting with the public and bringing the report back. Quite frankly, I don't think it means anything in terms of the timing of the report, or as it's indicated in the recommendation, because it refers to fall of 2013, and technically that takes us to December 21st. So I think that gives staff lots of latitude to do the consultation and come back. I think what's important to remember today is that we aren't approving anything. This is purely a draft report that's going to initiate further dialogue with the community. You know, I think it's also important to remember that as we talk about this isn't about talking about programs that are choosing downtown versus suburbia. Yes, without a question, there's been significant investments made in the downtown, but there have also been significant investments made in suburbia. New community centers like Kingsdale and Stanley Park, the Activa Sportsplex, facilities like McLennan Park, new libraries in Country Hills and Stanley Park, infrastructure improvements, the CMF, which largely serves suburban neighborhoods and the downtown neighborhoods as well. All of these are other investments that the city has made, substantive investments in our community. I think the reality is, if we don't see a strong downtown, we will begin to see increasingly weaker suburban neighborhoods throughout the city. And I've often likened the downtown to the foundation of a home, when if you don't fix some of those cracks, as we have done, the home eventually begins to crumble. And if we didn't address those downtown challenges, our suburbs, I believe, would be a lot worse off today than they are. And similar, if we don't solidify some of the gains we have made, and I think Chair Davey is right, we're not just quite there yet, we run the risk of falling behind again. Yes, at the end of the day, all of this means it's taxpayer funded, but in many cases this new development is development which otherwise wouldn't have happened, and development which has helped create new revenues which ultimately eliminate other budgetary challenges on our budget that impact all of our residents as well. So I look forward to the public input over the next number of months, and I think we're on the right track, certainly in terms of getting further input from the public in terms of where we go with this later in the fall.
Thank you. Recorded vote has been called. And that passes. Councillor Gazzola, I have you. Was that a mistake, or?
Councillor Verbanovich got to speak twice. It doesn't seem quite fair.
Yeah, he was moving the motion, and to be fair to you, I let Councillor Fernandez.
Pardon?
To be fair to you, I let Councillor Fernandez finish a thought as well. So, okay, I know we're actually almost an hour behind here, but we are going to take a quick 2-minute stretch, folks. Please make it 2 minutes, okay? Thank you. Okay, Mr. Haggie.
Hello, Chair Davey, members of council. I'm pleased to be here to talk about the 2014 budget process. Today we'll be going over, I have a brief presentation with the 5 following sections. They follow the same sections as we find in the report, and a lot of what I'm addressing in my speaking notes deals with content included in the report. The first area that we'll look at is budget context. And over the last few budget cycles, the overall message that we've heard from the community is noted at the top point of this slide. The community is looking for tax rate increases that approximate inflation while maintaining existing service levels. And this message is well aligned with Council's policy for setting tax rate increases, which we'll look at over the next few slides. As a reminder, Council has approved strategic directions for financial management that say that we should look at 3 factors when setting tax rate increases: comparison with other municipalities, inflationary increases, and citizens' willingness to pay for services and what level of service they would want. And we'll just flesh that out in a little more detail over the next few slides. So first, looking at comparison with other municipalities. The graph before you shows the City of Kitchener's relative tax burden to other large municipalities in Ontario. And Council has seen this graph a number of times before. As you can see, the City of Kitchener is the orange bar and is 5th lowest of large municipalities in Ontario, and is well below the average, which is about halfway or a little bit to the right of halfway in the yellow bar shown on the screen. The City of Kitchener is also lowest in the region, with Cambridge being 6th lowest and Waterloo being 11th lowest. All this is to say that the City of Kitchener has a low relative tax burden compared with other municipalities, large municipalities in Ontario. Turning our attention locally, tax increases for 2013 that were approved in large municipalities in the region show that the City of Kitchener had the lowest tax rate increase of any of those municipalities, lower than Cambridge, lower than Waterloo, and lower than the region. And based on published information on the 2014 budget, the City of Kitchener is pegged to have the lowest tax rate increase of those same municipalities. All this, again, is to say that the City of Kitchener compares favorably with other municipalities regionally as well across the province. Second factor to consider is inflation. And as shown in the chart here, there are a number of inflation factors to consider. The federal and provincial governments have included forecasts for inflation in 2013 of 1.5 and 1.3% respectively, whereas their forecasts in future years are 2% for 2014, 15, and 16. The most recent actual CPI number for Ontario was 1.3%, and the cumulative average over the first half of the year was 0.8%. As noted on the bottom of the slide, the City also calculates MPI, the Municipal Price Index, and that equates the impacts of inflation on our municipality. Over the last 2 years, MPI has been 0.25% higher than CPI, which means that the City is more susceptible to inflation impacts than a local average consumer. Finally, looking at service levels versus affordability. This is the third and final factor to consider. During the 2013 budget process, the City conducted a survey where 62% of respondents said that they prefer a tax rate increase that approximates inflation and maintains existing service levels. The finding of this far outweighs the other options and is consistent with the result from a 2009 study conducted by Environics. So that's all the budget context leading into the process. Now we'll look at major factors affecting the 2014 budget. We're just going to deal with some of the major ones, not getting into all the nitty-gritty of every single one, but first off is fire arbitration. And as Council is aware, fire services is the single most expensive cost element of the tax-supported budget, and the majority of those costs relate to compensation. Firefighters are currently without contract and are in a binding arbitration process that will see an arbitrator set the compensation increase for that bargaining unit. Based on past experience looking at other municipalities and in recent times, the arbitrated settlements having been higher than inflation, so this is causing upward pressure on the tax rate increase for 2014. Second factor impacting is cost of utilities on city-owned facilities. As council is aware, city owns a number of facilities and operates them, pools, community centers, and whatnot, and these have utility costs. Utility costs have been increasing at a rate higher than inflation, so again, this is causing upward pressure on the tax rate increase. Third factor to consider is assessment growth. And assessment growth is additional tax rate revenue that comes to the city based on new houses being built, so it's additional revenue that helps offset additional costs. And assessment growth trends over the last number of years have been declining. The city has been informed by MPAC that an assessment expectation for this year is 1%, so that's what the city is using for tax rate, or in setting the 2014 budget, assuming 1% tax rate, or 1% assessment growth. And staff are working directly with MPAC to ensure that that number is achieved, that all of the properties that are supposed to come online are captured and will be as part of the roll that's used for the end of the year. The next factor to consider is EDIF. There's already been a bit of discussion about that here this morning. EDIF, as council knows, is a 10-year funding program completed in 2013 and included a transfer directly from the tax base as well as issuing debt to fund that program. As of 2014, the direct transfer from the tax base is no longer needed, so that's a benefit to the tax rate. It's a cost that was built into the 2013 budget that is no longer required in the 2014 budget. The cost to service the debt need to still be built into the budget and will continue to be there until that debt retires, but that doesn't happen until between 2020 and 2029. Another factor to consider impacting this budget year is the Tax Stabilization Reserve Fund. For a number of years, this reserve fund has been used to subsidize the tax rate increases as funding has been transferred out of that reserve fund and into the tax base. The Tax Stabilization Reserve Fund is all but depleted now, so it cannot be used as an ongoing funding source as there's no funding in it. That needs to be eliminated, which causes upward pressure on the tax rate increase. The final factors impacting the budget I'll talk about together, and we'll deal with it in a bit more detail on a future slide. And there are unfunded items and strategic initiatives. Both of these items cannot be achieved within an inflationary budget target, so they will not be included in the budget submission from staff as far as being part of the base budget. But staff are suggesting that if assessment growth exceeds 1%, council could consider investing that in strategic initiatives or correcting ongoing budget deficits. And we will talk about that in a little more detail in a future slide. So with all the budget context that we've talked about, the factors in fact impacting the 2014 budget, the corporate leadership team, or CLT, is proposing budget targets for developing the 2014 budget. The CLT proposed target is an overall tax rate increase that should not exceed 1.25%. This is the most aggressive budget target that's been brought forward to council during this term of council. It's lower than the CPI expectations for both the federal and provincial governments. And it responds directly to what we've heard from citizens, that they're looking for a tax rate increase that approximates inflation but has no impact on service levels. That being said, there will be efficiency requirements to meet that target of 1.25%. Staff will once again be required to find efficiencies within their operating budget to get to the 1.25% budget target. Like last year, inflation will only be allowed for items concerning staff compensation, which are governed by the collective agreements for those areas, and for utility costs. All other costs are going to be held flat. And it should be noted that those items that are being held flat have been held flat since 2011. So it's not as if they're just being held at 2013 levels, they're being held at 2011 levels. So over the number of successive budgets, staff have already had to find efficiencies time and time again in order to meet the budget targets. So they've had to find other ways to deliver their services or reallocate budget dollars in order to pay for things that have seen inflation over that time, but they have not been provided for inflation in their budget targets. I alluded to this before, that we'll come back to talk about unfunded items and strategic initiatives, and this is where we'll discuss those. If assessment growth exceeds 1%, the 1% target, staff are saying that there are 3 different ways that council could consider using that funding. So one of those areas would be to invest it in strategic initiatives. The strategic initiatives are for enhancements of existing services, providing new services, or implementing master plans and audit findings. Staff are proposing to bring back a short list of options to council on October 21st committee day. Those would be tabled, will be discussed through future budget processes and future budget meetings, but it will allow a lot of time for council to review them, have discussions with the public, for the public to provide their input on it before council has to make any kind of decision on final budget day in January. The list proposed by staff will include items that are priorities of council that have been identified to staff, as well as internal priorities that council may not be aware of. A second option for council to consider is investing in unfunded operating items. As council is aware, there are 3 major areas that are underfunded: bylaw fine revenue, utility costs at city facilities, and operations. And those areas are causing chronic deficits within the operating budget. Council could invest additional assessment growth money into those areas, and then would see a decreased opportunity for negative variances, and may actually see surpluses within the operating budget. And if the city were to see surpluses within the operating budget, that would be closed off to the Tax Stabilization Reserve Fund, which is pretty much depleted, and therefore would be able to build that up to its minimum balance. A final option for council is just to let additional assessment revenue fall to the bottom line, which would have an impact of reducing the overall tax rate increase. So whatever that additional assessment growth is, it would drop the tax rate increase from 1.25% down to, depending on how much revenue is there. Turning our attention briefly to the enterprise budgets, CLT is proposing to follow the same principles that were used in the 2013 budget. That includes limiting on controllable costs, things under the city's control, to limiting the increase to those to an inflationary increase. But for non-controllable costs, so things like water and sanitary rates or increases that are passed through by the region, to allow those to flow through on the rates. So that may see water and sanitary increases that are above inflation, but it's a cause of the regional increase as opposed to what's under the city's control. Our second last section to look at is the budget schedule, and we'll just look briefly at that. The chart on the screen is the same as in the budget report, and it shows that the budget schedule is generally the same as the 2013 budget schedule. There are a number of dates that are bolded. Those indicate public meetings, so there are a number of opportunities for citizens to come, sit in the council chambers, and hear the discussion on the 2014 budget process in person. And finally, we'll look at the public input plan, which I was here for the last item. I know that there's a lot of interest in public engagement, and especially about the budget. The City of Kitchener has a good track record of opportunities for public engagement. On the slide, I've listed off a number of traditional methods, such as using print media and public delegation nights, as well as emerging in electronic media, so things like Twitter, Facebook, budget websites. So the city's been employing a number of those for a number of years to solicit feedback and inform the public about the budget process. For 2014, the city will continue using a number of those budget input opportunities or methods, and it's really in two goals in mind. First is to inform the public on what's included in the 2014 budget. The second reason is to solicit feedback from the public. We just don't want to say, here it is, this is what's going forward. We want to hear what they think about it. So there are a number of opportunities that are shown on the screen where citizens can come and provide their input on the budget. Through these different methodologies, this will provide the public with several opportunities to provide their input on the 2014 budget, which has the goal in mind of meeting the expectation of maintaining service levels at an inflationary tax rate increase. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll close my presentation and take any questions.
Very good, Ryan. Thank you. There are a number of people lined up here to speak. First, I have Councillor Singh.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I had a suggestion also along with the recommendation, which I can come back after the questions are all asked. And to you, Mr. Hagee, thank you a lot for taking all the fun out of this year's budget. You've made it far too easy for us. So partly thank you, and then again, it's not going to be as entertaining for this year on perhaps. Some questions I had was for the MPAC assessment. Obviously, that's been alluded to already this year. Some of the, I guess it's a little lower than where we were at last year. Is it perhaps that some of the development hasn't already been picked up by MPAC? That's partly, and also other developments are at later phases in completion, which would come in line closer to the end of the year.
So through you, Mr. Chair, I would suggest that it is a function of assessment that has already happened that may not have been picked up already by MPAC. Our staff have a good relationship with MPAC and are working directly with them. The number that we have seen as of the end of July is considerably lower than what we know is coming. And we believe that the 1% target is achievable, and hopefully that we'll be able to exceed that.
That's great, and that's good to see. And I think it would be helpful for staff. Of course, we have to be fearful that we don't end up being lower than that 1% either. That we get ongoing updates as to where we're sitting as obviously more data comes in as well as part of the full budget process. The other question I had was for inflation. So the projected CPI inflation, I'm going to deal with just for the province, is sitting at 1.5%. When they make that assessment, is that ongoing? Do they readjust, or this was the projection that made last year, or the 2013 projected?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the projection that the province is making was as of their budget process. Typically be early in the year, but they did not pass their budget until later, so their projection is actually fairly current. I believe it's as of April or May.
Okay, that's good to get that information. So it's in more line with additional data that's already come in for this year as
Correct.
well. To compare, obviously the rolling average kind of gives a little bit of cause for pause. It's sitting at 0.8% relative to what the projection is at 1.5 for Ontario. If you had to compare for last year, do we have any data on hand where the half-point mark of last year, where inflation was sitting at relative to the end of year?
We would have that, Mr. Chair. I don't have it with me, but we keep track of the monthly changes.
Through the chair, I don't have the specific numbers, but you may recall we actually started off trending high at the beginning of the year, and inflation fell towards the bottom of the year. And so we're actually hopeful that we'll see a reversal of that trend, and that because we ended so low last year, it's in the latter half of this year that we'll actually see the month-to-month changes increasing. We don't know if June is the start of a trend, but certainly it's one of the highest numbers we've seen so far this year.
Okay. All right. Good. And the last thing, we don't have data for July then? Okay.
No, through you, Mr. Chair, it generally comes out the third Friday of the month, but not always.
Yeah, I thought so. I wasn't sure. I know that sometimes these reports are done a little early, so I wasn't sure if July data had come in yet or not. So the last question I had for now was for the, on page 5-9, for tax stabilization. Again, you refer to over-reliance on the tax stabilization fund to mitigate some of the tax increases in previous years, where it's put a lot of pressure. And again, it's the fund is almost depleted at this point.
Correct.
Now, reallocating additional focus to it. If you look at the summary, you are saying that the emphasis would be to put some 955,000 or 0.1, almost close to 1%.
Correct.
Allocation towards the tax stabilization. Is that just to meet the need for this year because of the reliance in the previous years, or is this ongoing funding to bring it to a certain level? I know you referred to it a little bit, but more explanation would be helpful.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the 955 is the complete amount, or the total amount transferred from the Tax Stabilization Reserve Fund to the tax base as of 2013. The reserve fund, I believe right now has about $700,000 in it. So this is a complete elimination of that transfer. There is funding in it right now, but we're also projecting to have a deficit at the end of the year. So that would
deficit, that would be if we don't do this I guess build it into the base. If you were not to do it, then there would be a deficit because there is 700,000 sitting in the reserve. Correct.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So we do have opportunity to. Of course, there's importance and obviously to better fund, plan for our finances. This appropriate allocation to this reserve is necessary, and we do have to build it back to appropriate levels, which will take some time. But we don't have to be as aggressive to fund it to this reserve at what's suggested in the summary. It's up for discussion.
Through you, Mr. Chair, this isn't adding money to the reserve fund. This is taking the money, eliminating the revenue coming in from that reserve fund.
This is eliminating the money?
Right now, there's a $955,000 that is transferred from the reserve fund.
I'm looking at projected percent levy increase. So the way I see it is, when we look at the tax stabilization reserve fund of allocating, it's building into the budget a 0.91%. And now that's going forward. It's going to be built into the budget. That means each year would be able to fund 0.91% going forward, unless we were to reallocate it in future years.
So through you, Mr. Chair, I believe what Councillor Singh is saying, that his understanding is that it's almost that it's zero right now, and we're transferring 955 into the reserve fund.
I realize there's some monies there right now.
The reality is that we're transferring money out of the reserve fund. So right now there's a revenue of 955 coming in from the reserve fund, and this is eliminating it because we can't. It's a bank account essentially that has no more money, so we can't take money out of it.
Okay, fair enough. So again, I'll come back with my suggestion later then.
Actually, in the interest of time, Councillor Singh, if you just wanted to, I'm not sure if it's in the form of a motion, but if you wanted to sort of float the idea of the suggestion, just to save people from going around commenting on it a second time.
Sure, that's no problem. I'll fine-tune the wording to the staff recommendation in the report, but it would be that staff prepare a budget more closer in line to 1% rather than the 1.25 that's in the staff recommendation. I don't think it's too far off. It's primarily to safeguard in case inflation doesn't end up being at the projected amount, and also if it does, it will give council opportunity to perhaps fund areas that are unfunded. Certain areas that Mr. Hagee has already alluded to, and one thing that hasn't been already mentioned, but the EAB is a looming problem that has to be considered. So it gives multiple opportunities. So,
okay, thank you. And again, same for the rest of the committee. If you have intention, please sort of make that intention known so we can sort of get it all on the table. Councillor Yaneski.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being able to comment on this, and appreciate the tightness of the report. I'm glad to see that the starting point, 1.25, is much lower than we had last year, and all the challenges we have. I'm not sure whether the 1.25 will be even more challenging because there'll be not too much wiggle room on this, but on the other hand, it may be easier. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see that process when we get there. I'm glad we are at the 1.25 starting point. I'm not prepared to go down to 1.0 as suggested in the amendment. I think we do need some looking where we're going. By the time we get to the end of the year, we'll see where the inflation rate is as well. It may be coming up on an upswing, as noted. That's something we'll just have to take a look at in the next 4, 5, 6 months as we get to the January date. A couple of questions I have. I noticed in the report that you alluded that we got one of the lowest tax rates in the province, and you got that chart listing about 24 municipalities, and we are near the bottom. But actually, that's without the SWIM component, which is what's included in other municipalities, because you did allude that if we include that, then we swing over to the right a little more. That's correct?
Correct.
Okay. One thing I find with your assessment comment is that your target is 1%, and if we do achieve that, then we can now fund money to different potential projects or areas that we feel are worthy of it. Yet you note that our growth as of July is 0.03%.
Correct.
Which is really nothing, really, compared to previous years, which is 1.5%, 1.8%, 2% as we go backwards. So it's really been going down. In fact, it looks like it's really down to nothing. And you did indicate that you're going to try to target to work with Impact to try to get them to get the assessment reevaluated and updated, basically, which is a good target. However, I've also noted that based on comments from staff and other departments that our building permits have also been down over the last 12 months or so, just for whatever reasons, the economy just sort of slowing down, although interest rates are still reasonable, inflation is very, very reasonable, and I find it sort of hard to understand why the assessment is not moving quicker if those factors look so favorable. In fact, I also wonder, when you have a comment of we have one of the lowest rankings of taxes in the province, meaning that we're one of the most affordable cities in Ontario, which I would agree with. Then why isn't our assessment growing?
Okay.
Why aren't people coming?
Mr. Chapman, do you want to comment first?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we have exactly the same questions as you do. We've seen building permit activity. We have closed building permits that should be contributing to new assessment. In fact, internally, we're able to build up right now to a number at year end that would be as high as 0.9%. So we don't know why MPAC has not picked that up. We're pursuing it with them, and we're committed, as Ryan noted, to push really hard to get to that 1% number and go beyond it to the extent we can.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I know it's a challenge. It's just
but it's a mystery to us as well as to why that's not been picked up year to date, but we're on it and we'll pursue it to the end of the year.
Appreciate that. There's no reference here at all in terms of the potential increase of user fees. Where are you coming from on that? What's your focus on in terms of percentage increase? It's always been more than we've always budgeted for in terms of the tax rate, because user fees are user oriented. Where are you going on this?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the internal guideline for user fees is 2% increase.
Okay.
And sir, just quick, that one, it was 3% last year, correct?
Correct.
It was 3% last year, yeah. Oh, and final comment, you talked about two different options and the impacts of the chronic deficit being the bylaw fine revenues, water utility cost operation, but you also mentioned electricity costs. How does that fit into our scenario here, hydro stuff?
So through you, Mr. Chair, the electricity costs are the electricity costs we have to pay for city-run facilities. So the city has City Hall, we've got the lights on our...
So hydro increases the cost and we've got to pay for that?
Correct.
Okay. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ioannidis.
Thanks, Ryan, for your presentation, and I really like the way where we're heading in the direction with our budget, and I just wanted to get a few questions about, one in particular, about our local tax comparison. And you have Waterloo as before swim phase, and do you have roughly an idea what there would be with that swim fee?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't recall what the exact amount is. The tax rate increase is lower because they're moving. Essentially, we did it all in one shot.
Okay.
They're doing it over a number of years.
Yep.
But for comparative purposes, the 1.55 is effectively what their tax rate increase was in 2013, and they're suggesting 246.
So we're in a lot better shape than they are currently.
Correct.
Okay. One other thing that you touched upon, but you didn't really, you mentioned it in the report, and for the benefit of the new live streaming, I was wondering if you could just give a little bit more of what MPI is and the differences in between what's in MPI. Sure.
Through you, Mr. Chair, MPI stands for Municipal Price Index, And the city calculates that every year to say, what are the inflation factors on the municipality as opposed to an individual? So CPI is calculated for the average consumer, average household, the types of things that they buy. It includes cost of housing, groceries, those types of things. Municipality is different, as a municipality has to buy asphalt and contracted services and pay employees. So the city calculates a municipal price index that says what are the inflation factors unique to the municipality, and it's different than the inflation factors for an individual.
Okay, that's great. And I guess I'll make just a final comment. I'm willing to support Councillor Singh's update or recommendation. I think we can always try to squeeze a little bit more if we can. If not, then we know where we stand, and I don't have a problem with that. Okay.
Councillor Fernandez?
Thank you. I have a few questions, and some of them have come out of your presentation. Thank you very much for very clear and concise. It's good to know that we're at least working towards an inflationary increase. So one of the questions I have is just a quick question to the chair. Has this been moved yet?
It has not.
It has not been moved. Okay. And so if I wanted to move it, then
Councillor Singh requested
he made an
to bring
amendment.
forward. So, yes, so he'll be.
Okay.
I'm not sure he's making an amendment or making a motion, so we'll have to go to Councillor Singh first.
Okay. Okay. I wanted to know whether I was jumping the queue on some things. Okay. If we were to go with the 1% amended motion by Councillor Singh, would we be able to get a rough idea of what the 0.25% would be in a dollar value?
Through the chair, the 2.5% is about $250,000. It would be a little bit higher, maybe $265,000.
Okay. So that, I get, the reason I'm asking that is I would like to have an understanding, because in a meeting I had with Mr. Chapman, our discussion was around anything above inflation could be used, as you pointed out in your graph, for strategic initiatives, or to reduce the budget, or for operating budget deficits. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Is there a way that we can reduce some of our non-fixed costs, like our electricity and our water, within our facilities even more? I know that I have brought this up in the past about lights being on, and I know that we have a system that we're using so that lights are dimmed and turned off, at a certain time. Can we reduce that by a couple of hours? So instead of all of the lights, shutting off at 10 or 11, I think it is, that it goes to 8 o'clock. Could we see a savings if we were to do that through an entire year?
Sorry. Ms. Houston, but I want to be careful too that we don't get into, again, specific examples of how we can reduce the budget. That should be handled offline or at a separate time. But Ms. Houston.
Thank you, Chair Davey. We can look at that. Again, we do have an active energy management program, and we do have automated control systems for most of our facilities that do some of that work automatically. I believe FM will be bringing an energy management report to Council in the near future, possibly the fall, to give you some of that information. But we do take a pretty aggressive approach to that already, but we will look at it again for budget purposes.
Okay, that would be great. I'd appreciate that. Thank you. My understanding is that if we don't achieve the 1% growth, then we would need to increase the tax levy by that difference. So if we only achieved a 0.9% assessment growth, we would have to offset that by increasing our if we were to go with the 1%, we'd have to go up to 1.1. Is that right?
Through the chair, it would either be that option, or before the budget is tabled, staff would have to try to find about $100,000 to offset that difference.
Okay. Is that direction that you would want from us at this point in time?
If I can respond to that question, Mr. Chair.
Please.
I think our commitment, if Council supports the recommendation, is to submit a budget at 1.25% or lower. We're confident enough today that our assessment growth is approaching 1% to make that commitment. And so as Ryan said, if we fall short by a small margin, we would work to find that within the target that Council sets. I wouldn't be making that commitment if we felt that assessment growth was only going to be 0.2 or 0.3% for 2014.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. I know that we've talked in the past about salary increases and ones that are outside of our collective agreement control. Will there be salary increases built into this budget at the 1% or 1.25%?
Through the chair, yes, there are salary increases built in. The contracts that are known are at the known amounts. Ones that are unknown, there's an estimate put in.
Okay, but I'm talking about the ones that are not in a collective agreement. So there's salary increases built into that budget as well.
Correct.
Okay, so is there some direction that we can give now already so that we're not surprising people?
It's your prerogative if you want to. I would suggest that if you're interested in that discussion, we should handle it as we have in previous budgets, closer to the time to deal with it at operating.
Well, I don't want to delay that. I'll let Mr. Chapman talk.
Mr. Chapman?
And maybe I can offer one fact. I think typically where Council has exercised that discretion has been around senior management salary adjustments. The city's policy says that management staff follow the collective agreement for 791, and this is the year that Council will give direction for the renegotiation of the 791 contract. And so my suggestion is that ultimately that's the vehicle to give direction. We've always identified the concerns around compression or pay equity when you vary steps at different rates. And so we will be coming forward to seek direction for the 791 contract. Presently, the Council policy says whatever is awarded through that contract, which you will agree to, would apply to the balance of the salary grid.
Okay, and that will come to us before the budget?
We can certainly make a commitment to have that discussion with you before the budget. We may not be seeking a formal mandate, but certainly your direction for budget estimates, yes, we can.
Yeah, I think that would be prudent. The other question I have is regarding overtime policy. Maybe we can have a discussion I don't want to enter into a huge discussion right now, but what is our policy? Can we affect that set direction about overtime now for next year's budget? No, you don't understand? Am I not being clear? I'm sorry.
Through the chair, I understand the question. I just don't know that I'm in a place to comment on it or whether it's appropriate within the entire budget context.
I just that if there's an opportunity now to start saying that we don't want to have any overtime in the coming year, so that we can keep within line with the 1%, then if we start setting that direction now, then we may put ourselves in a better position.
And what I might suggest, Mr. Chairman, is that I think Council would probably benefit from some information on overtime practices and costs and that sort of thing. And so either as an issue paper or if more appropriately under labor relations as a caucus discussion, we can bring that back through the process.
Okay, I think that would be prudent to have it again beforehand so that we can sort of get our heads around those numbers. Okay, thank you. And I would like to suggest that would like to support Councillor Singh's 1%. I think that we can get there, and I think it's a good incentive. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Councillor Gazzola?
Yeah, I want to start off by saying that this is the 40th time I've been dealing with the City of Kitchener's budget, so I think that's interesting to me, if to no one else. Just a couple of questions. I'd like to know if you could go to 5.9 or that schedule there. What is it that is what changes are there? For example, is the base inflation, is that what have you used?
Through the chair, the amount of $2.6 million or 2.5%, or sorry, I'll just back up. All the information in that chart was comes out of the 10-year tax rate
No, I
forecast
realize
from
that.
last
So
year.
what has changed so that we come in with 1.25?
Through the chair, I'll draw your attention down to line D. It's subtotal 1, the black line. You'll see all of the items above that subtotal to 1.92%. A reduction of 0.67% is required to get down to 1.25%, and that's what staff have committed to doing as part of developing the budget process, or tabling a budget before council. Staff will review all of the budget items and reduce where required to get to 1.25%. The items below that, you'll see strategic initiatives and unfunded items have been completely removed from the forecasted budget, and those would only be considered by council if assessment growth exceeds 1%.
Okay, so that's the point. I wanted to, where you had those all in last year, or in the 10-year, you've taken them out, and you reduced the top, you said by point, what, 6?
0.67.
7, yeah. So which came out of what?
Through the chair, those are just the reductions that are required to get to the targeted amount of 1.25%. It hasn't come out of any one specific line.
All right, so going back, when people are preparing budgets, what are you using for the base inflation?
And I think, just to clarify the point, that 0.67 really is coming against base inflation. And so what we're doing is only allowing increases for collectively bargained wage settlements and for things like utility costs. All our lines are being held flat. It doesn't mean there are no increases in many of those lines. It just means we'll have to offset those increases with reductions elsewhere.
Okay, that's the point. That figure, that's where most of this comes from, out of that line there.
That's correct.
Yeah. I have one big concern about next year, and that's with our firefighters arbitration. What plans do we have if we know that that's not going to go in the direction we want it to go? So,
And I would suggest, Mr. Chair, we're certainly happy to have that discussion. I would suggest that as we recess into caucus, we can discuss it there. Labor relations staff will be in attendance, in fact, and so we can speak to it in caucus shortly.
Okay, I think that's important because we need to deal with that. So, as far as this, it's now being called Mr. Singh's recommendation, I will support it if you'll put just one word in before that figure of 1, if you'll put the word below in. And reason, I'd really like to give, I know staff have a big challenge ahead of them to get where we are, but I'd just like to give staff a little bigger challenge. I know that they can do it. So, thank you.
Councillor Urbanovich?
Thank you very much. And I too want to thank staff for the recommendation that's before us. I think it is fairly aggressive, and it's hard not to note the chart on page 5-2 that's actually seen us move back one spot from being the 6th lowest to now being the 5th lowest. So I think that demonstrates the positive work that's been done by both this council and our staff in terms of dealing with things. I do want to clarify the motion that Councillor Singh is bringing forward with the suggested change, because I would like to be supportive of it. If I understand it correctly, you're suggesting that staff would come in at 1%, assuming that the annual inflation comes in at 1% or less. If in fact the number is higher, in other words, if it's at 1.25 or higher, the target remains 1.25. Is that correct?
Councillor Singh?
I can only speak for myself, and my effort is to come in with a budget that's at inflation. And if inflation ends up being higher than 1%, I think we have to look at opportunities to look at within the corporation of areas that are underfunded. So, yes, to answer your question.
Okay, because that was important to me, because I think I'm willing to, I think it's important that we accept that target of inflation, but if in fact inflation was going to be higher, depending on what happens in the last few months of the year, I was concerned that we were setting an increasingly unrealistic amount for staff and ultimately us to attain. So I will be supporting your recommendation. I think it allows staff to come forward with some additional recommendations around either additional revenues or cuts that would get us to that 1% and allow us to be in that inflation target zone. And as you indicated, if we see some gains through things like assessment and so on, we can begin to address some of the unfunded items in the budget as well.
Mayor Zer?
Thank you. I had a private conversation with Councillor Singh here just to understand the motion. I think we have to have the written, or if not written, but this very specific motion here, because I am quite confused by the discussions that are going on. The target is either 1% or it's 1.25 or it's inflation. And before I make my comments, I need to know that because I have some concerns about where this is going.
I had some questions as well. Councillor Singh, are you
prepared to actually put the motion or I guess the amendment, which
okay? If you could just, sir, if you could ring in, there you go.
Thank you.
Councillor Singh, we'll go back to you, Mayor Zer.
So if I can briefly just say something beforehand, so just to give clarity as well. I want to be very, I want to commend staff for bringing a budget that's very fair and very reasonable at this point. It's cognizant of what Council has said in previous budget processes, that our efforts to bring a budget that's more in line to inflationary increase, and that's what our taxpayers want to. And that's why my original intent was for it not to be a totally separate motion, but to be more of a complementary amendment to what staff is recommending. That as part of the motion that they're saying, therefore be it resolved, the staff be directed to submit the 2014 tax-supported budget with a levy increase not exceeding 1.2%. That can stand. My amendment to that is that staff also be directed to bring forward suggestions for an additional 0.25% decrease, and this be explored, and I want to put emphasis on this as well, and this be explored, if it hasn't already by staff, this be explored with setting aggressive revenue generation targets from our sponsorship strategy, and that and additional from adjustments that have limited service level impact. Hopefully that clarifies to some of your concern, Mr. Mayor. Or
okay, then, if I may, Mr. Chairman, if we follow then what Councillor Singh is suggesting, we really do need to have this motion on the floor first, and he needs to make an amendment to add those comments and the supplementary.
Until that point, I was unclear whether he was moving this motion or introducing a new one.
I wasn't either. So,
point of order, Councillor Rabinovich?
Sorry, in all due respect, I mean, if Councillor Singh is moving the motion, I would believe, Mr. Chair, that he's able to either move the recommendation before us or move a different recommendation.
I don't disagree with that.
And,
that's not what I'm saying.
If it's a different one, then we can ask that a certain clause be dealt with separately.
Okay. So
I'm not disagreeing with that. I heard Councillor Singh just say a moment ago that he agrees with the recommendation that is here but wants to add something. So I don't care who moves it, whether it's Councillor Singh and add something to it, or Councillor Fernandez said, has the motion been moved yet? I'm not looking that I have to move it. I just want to have the process so I know what I'm voting on and when. So, Mr. Chair, your direction.
Okay, so as I understand, Councillor Singh, you can just, I guess, nod. You're moving the motion as it is with the amendment that...
For the additional suggestions for reductions by a quarter.
Okay. And could you just, for one final time, could you repeat the actual amendment to the existing?
It's in addition to the motion, that's correct, yeah. Okay, all right. It's in addition to the motion. Right.
Okay.
Okay. And could you repeat it one last time so we have it?
Repeating.
So the addition to the motion is that staff be directed to bring forward suggestions for an additional 0.25% reduction to the tax-supported budget levy increase where it's already recommended by staff that not be exceeding 1.25%. And this be explored through setting aggressive revenue generation targets from the sponsorship strategy. And the suggestions for reductions that would come forward, that they have limited service level impact.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for the clarification, because I wanted to make sure that the rest of what was being talked about in the recommendation that's before us on 5-1 were included, and they are now, and that's good. And I can support the revised motion, which Councillor Singh is bringing forward now. The only uncomfortableness that I have with that is not to have a lower rate, but in terms of the kind of direction, the kind of consequence of establishing something lower than where they are at this point in time, is that it will take an inordinate amount of time to work on a relatively small dollar figure, $250,000, in that they are already having to find efficiencies from the 1.9, I think it is, down to the 1.25. I have an uncomfortable feeling about it, but for this purpose, at this time, I can support the recommendation. But I think if it becomes a major task, and normally when some of those cuts come back to us for further reductions, they're unpalatable quite often by members of council or majority of council, and so I'm just concerned the length of time and the energy that will go into what may not be acceptable. But at this point in time, I can support the recommendation with the addition that Councillor Singh has put on it.
Okay. I have some questions as well, and first off, I want to be clear on this question of staff. Right now, I mean, part of the problem here is we do have the percentage target of 1.25%, but between the moving target, and I'm looking for a professional opinion, between the moving target of assessment growth and the moving target of inflation, is staff confident that we will bring in a budget that will be at inflation by the end of the year? Mr. Chapman.
We cannot predict what inflation will be. We think we're certainly within the reasonable range. To the points around resourcing and workload, it's certainly an advantage for us if council can agree to some principles now, and then we're held to those through the balance of the budget process. What will be a challenge is if, based on some new information in December or January, there's a fundamental change to the budget direction. That's when it's difficult for us to adjust. But at this point in time, we have a reasonable degree of confidence around the assessment growth number. It would appear as if inflation is trending within this range, and if council can see its way to give clear direction today, we have the next couple of months to work towards that direction.
Okay, so in terms of Councillor Singh's motion, then I guess my question would be, what would staff be doing then to, because we haven't actually said, well, Councillor Singh mentioned the sponsorship strategy, which is a separate question. Is there any revenue generation expected in 2014 via the sponsorship strategy? Mr. May?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's work that's currently underway, so I don't have that answer for you. The intention, we were aiming for an October or November timeframe to bring the strategy back. All I would say to council is what I've said about the sponsorship strategy every time I've spoken. It will take many years to hit the types of targets that I know some councillors have spoken about, and I am not confident at this point. I can't say to you today that there'll be revenue next year.
Okay. But on that point, Mr. Chair, if council is open to alternative revenue suggestions, it's still helpful to have that in the clause, that council would entertain alternate revenue sources as opposed to simply service level or budget reductions. So even if not through sponsorship, if Councillor Singh's intent here is that we're looking at non-tax revenue sources, I would suggest that you keep that reference in.
Okay. And I guess one last question. So I'm unclear, and a question of Councillor Singh, I'm unclear. So supposing that we come back in October, for example, and inflation is ticking up, like it's ticked up as some of us are expecting it will, would staff still be presenting an additional 0.25% reduction?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
there's a lot of areas within the corporation that are underfunded that we have to look at. So it gives us the advantage to do so.
Okay, I'm going to go to Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification about other revenue streams. Can you give me a sense of what that is?
From time to time, we identify that we do not charge for a fee that's very commonplace elsewhere in municipal government, and we brought those recommendations forward to council. As some councillors will attest to, not always without controversy, but certainly we want to explore those, and some of those may find their way onto the list.
And would that also be like we did last year, where you believe we used some of the revenue from the solar panels? Is that the same kind of idea?
No, I don't believe so, although certainly we'll look at creative solutions. The other operative word I heard in that resolution was minimal service level impact, and so we can't commit that there will be no service level reductions, but for the value that we're talking about, we will not bring forward items that we know are non-starters and would have major service level impact.
Okay, I have no further questions. It's been moved by Councillor Singh. I would think that a recorded vote is in order, even though I haven't. Councillor Singh, do you want to comment?
Quickly, I think through the discussion back and forth, there's a strong handle as to what the intent of change to the staff recommendation was, but if I can still speak to the change or make a comment if that would be appropriate, because I don't think I've really had the full potential, full ability to do so with the earlier questions. So without repeating the change, what I pretty much want to say is that the revenue generation was, or the sponsorship strategy was an example towards areas that we need to be looking at, that this corporation needs to constantly look at areas that we can utilize from returns on our assets, assets that are owned by our taxpayers, and they expect better returns on them. And so if we can think outside the box to look at revenue generation potentials, we need to seek those out. And if they can mitigate to lower the tax impact, we have to take that ability. And of course, the additional ways that can be done is from previous budgets where suggestions had come forward with changes within the corporation or efficiencies. But of course, the key point was that it have a low impact on our service levels. And I think it's already the essence of the change has already been made, that it's not to suggest that the budget come in line at 1%. It's whatever the budget comes in, due to whatever the economies are at that point, that there still be additional 0.25% suggestions, so that if we have the ability to build into our base budget to mitigate on some areas of a corporation where the funding isn't there, especially the EAB. That's one area that has no funding allocation yet and needs some significant resource allocation, that we have to take that opportunity at that point. It gives us additional 0.25% buffer no matter what.
Okay, I'll just comment briefly as well. I'll support the amendment. I just wanted to comment briefly on the work here as well. I think what we're looking at right here is fantastic. I think that we went out and asked a difficult question in the survey last year about what's an appropriate amount of money. It's always difficult to ask somebody what can you afford. But we went out and asked the question. We were mandated inflation, and I want to commend staff for responding, because last year our increase was one of the lowest in Ontario, 1.39, and now the upper end target at 1.25 is really fantastic. So very happy to see what's before us, and I'll be supporting Councillor Singh's motion. Sorry, I have Councillor Gazzola in the queue. Did you? Okay, just very briefly.
I had asked that that the word below would be put in. I've always supported going with the inflation rate, and right now the inflation rate is 0.8, and I would like to see that. I just think we're not talking a lot of dollars. It's just the principle of what we're holding before us, that we're sticking to it, that we've tried over the years to stick to it. I've always felt that we can stick to it. I know that we have a low tax rate and all that, and we well should have. We're the only city in the province that has a gas natural gas operation that's putting a lot of dollars into our system. So I'm not going to support what's before, but not that I don't. I just want to live on my principle that I would like to see us go by the inflation rate.
Thank you. Councillor Galloway-Seelock, final word.
Sorry, I wasn't going to say anything, but I just figure I'll make a couple comments. I think that for early in the stage of our budget process, we're sitting in a really good point. And I think the additional direction that's given is something that's important. We still have the ability to get to inflation no matter where it ends up now. We're in August, and it's really a guessing game right now. And I think as we continue to get closer to final budget, we'll be able to see what its assessment growth is, as well as what inflation is. So if inflation stays at 0.8% as it is now, we still have the ability as a council to get to that level in various ways. But I think this is a really good direction for August the 12th in our budget process. So it's the first time with me being around this table that we're even starting at this point. So I commend staff on that.
Okay. Recorded vote's been called. And that carries. Okay, we will move on to the final item, which is essentially a housekeeping item. I'm not sure if anyone's speaking to it. Could I get a mover, actually? Moved by Councillor Galloway-Seelock. Councillor Gazzola, question.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to why this is being taken immediately to council today. I don't understand. What are we doing here? And I'm saying this, Mr. Turner, you're aware of why I happen to have an issue in the ward that I represent that is dealing with this very thing. And I'm not sure what we're doing here. What is it saying? And it's obviously been around for a long time. Why do we have to take it to council immediately and pass it today?
Mr. Turner?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, first of all, this is a housekeeping amendment that really doesn't change the intent of the bylaw. What it speaks to is situations where people choose to store their household garbage outside. We've always had a provision in our lot maintenance bylaw that allows them to do it, but there was an interaction between our lot maintenance bylaw and the city's waste collection bylaw, which was basically declared redundant many years ago when the region took over waste collection. So it's really something that we just noticed recently dealing with, as a result of dealing with a couple of situations that are currently on our books. So it's my understanding that this was referred to special counsel to give us the opportunity to move forward with it with a couple of particular situations that we have now, given that the council meeting is delayed by 1 week. So it'll be 2 weeks from now that we'd be able to act next.
Yeah, so why can't it be ratified in 2 weeks? Why? I mean, how long has this been out of whack?
It's been out of whack for several years, but we just noticed it recently when dealing with a couple of situations that we weren't able to effectively deal with. And when we looked at the bylaw, we realized that it was something that should have been cleaned up years ago and never was.
Well, in view of what's going on in the ward that I represent, and you're well aware, but I would like to leave this to have it go through its normal process.
Okay, that's a statement.
It's a request, I guess, because I want to take it off of today's council
Okay,
agenda.
I'll take that then. Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
I would request actually the opposite, because I'm dealing with something very specific with regards to this in the ward that I represent. It's a matter that's been going on for a long time, and residents are choosing not to necessarily be good neighbors, and this gives us the ability as bylaw to try and enforce and help a very negative situation that is brewing with neighbors. So I've also been dealing with this matter, and actually when seeing, first of all, because we are in the summer months, and the problem of what I'm dealing with is worse in the summer months, I think it's important for us to move forward and be able to have a little bit stronger leg to stand on when it comes to this matter and with regards to neighbors. So I would ask that it continue to move forward so we can deal with it in a sooner manner than a later date.
And actually, on that point, on recollection, I don't believe we have power at this point to. You have to raise that at special council, if I'm correct. We couldn't take it off. You just vote on this issue now, and then if you didn't want to deal with it at special council, then you'd have to bring it up at that point.
I'll try again there.
Thank you. Okay, I have no other comments. Moved by Councillor Galloway-Seelock. Those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, Mr. Goody, just in terms of, you might want to think about timing to start community services, if you could. Councillor or Mayor Zaire is going to be taking for special council.
Yes.